Everyone, my name is Malak Hassan, and today I'm going to be giving you the histology crash course. Now, don't let the number of slides scare you. It's majority of it is pictures and questions. So yeah, let's get this rolling. You'll notice it's a little kind of like a game theme, like a harvest. But yeah. Okay, so the agenda for today, we're going to be following these steps for every component. Okay, so first we're going to explain, then we're going to look at real images, then we're going to do question solving, all right? Now, I want you to keep an eye out for the clinical star. This star, whenever you see it, it means that there's going to be a clinical or medical application, okay? Now, first of all, we're going to choose our character. Today, we're going to be talking about bone, muscle, and skin histology. We're going to start off with bone. Now, let's see. Bone and cartilage. Okay, so first of all, what are we going to cover today? First of all, we're going to cover the basic composition and the functional roles of cartilage and bone, classification of cartilage, cartilage architecture and growth, and then we're going to move on to bone. We're going to talk about bone matrix, organization, and mineralization. Oops, sorry, something happened. Okay, okay. Can you see my screen? All right. So we have the microstructure of compact bone and trabecular bone. We also have the bone cells and bone remodeling. And bone coverings, pathway of bone formation, etc., etc. All right? Okay. So, first of all, let's talk about the basic composition of cartilage and bone. So, cartilage and bone are both connective tissues, okay, but each one is specialized. What does that mean? It means that it has specific characteristics that are responsible for making it the way that it is. Now, as we all know, connective tissues in general are made up of cells and extracellular matrix, all right? And cartilage and bone, طبعا, we know that they're for movement, protection, internal regulation, and they're both very different from each other, but they're still very related. Now, let's talk about some connective tissue basics. Any connective tissue, okay, any connective tissue in the world is going to be made up of cells and extracellular matrix. In other words, cells and the stuff surrounding the cells. Now, where do these cells come from? They come from something called mesenchymal stem cells. Every connective tissue, okay, all connective tissue cells will come from mesenchymal stem cells. And these, we can consider them kind of like the mother cells for cartilage cells and bone cells. So you'll have mesenchymal stem cells. They'll differentiate into chondroblasts to make chondrocytes. Blasts is kind of like the baby form of the cell, okay? And cytes is like the mature form of the cell. Mesenchymal stem cells will also differentiate into osteoblasts and they'll mature into osteocytes. Tamam? Okay. So we have this image from your lecture, mesenchymal stem cells, chondroblast, chondrocyte. Now, what is the basic composition of cartilage and bone? Let's talk about cartilage first, okay? Cartilage is a connective tissue, tamam? So like we said, like all other connective tissues, it's going to be made up of cells and extracellular matrix. Specifically, the cells here are going to be chondrocytes, all right? And extracellular matrix. Now, if we look at this image here, you'll see that most of it, okay, is actually matrix. So more than 95% is the matrix, okay? And the chondrocytes, they're going to be few in number, okay, about 3 to 5%, but they are responsible for producing and maintaining the matrix. So they're not just going to be swimming around doing nothing. They're going to be in there producing and maintaining the matrix, which makes up more than 95% of the volume. Now, I want you to keep in mind for now that the extracellular matrix is made up of fibers and ground substance. So just keep that in mind for now. So your ECM is made up of fibers and ground substance. Now, chondroblasts and chondrocytes. Now, chondrocytes, like we said, they only make up 3 to 4% of the cartilage volume, and these are the mature cells that secrete and maintain all of the components of the extracellular matrix, tamam? And you'll find them here in this picture. They reside in little things called lacuna, okay, like little halos. And they come from chondroblasts, like we mentioned. And if we look here on the side, this is the perichondrium, tamam. Here you have elliptical shaped kind of chondroblasts. These are the baby cells that make the chondrocytes. Now, once they become part of the matrix, they find themselves in the matrix, that's when we call them chondrocytes. Okay, so chondroblasts come from, like we said, mesenchymal origin, and then they form chondroblasts, which are the thin elliptical cells that are found near the surface, and then they find themselves within the matrix, and that's what makes them chondrocytes. Now, here we have our chondrocytes. Okay, they live within the matrix, right? They live within their little lacuna. When they want to divide, they divide by mitosis, right? They start to form little groups, okay? These little clusters of cells like this. And they start to form little groups. We call those isogenous groups. And those groups are like 2, 4, 8 cells because they're dividing, right? And these clusters, we can see them under the microscope, right? They all come from a single chondroblast. So it's not just a coincidence that they're there together. No, they come from the same chondroblast. Tamam? Now, as like the cells start to produce more and more and more matrix, they're eventually going to separate from each other. Okay? And then they're going to occupy separate lacuna. So you can see here there is a chondroblast and a separate lacuna, chondroblast and a separate lacuna, etc., etc. Okay? Now, there's a little piece of information you need to know. They will be pushed apart, right? But they need to make space for themselves. So what do? They secrete something called MMPs. These are enzymes that are going to digest and break down the ECM. All right. Now, what are the features of the chondroblasts? Well, if we look at the microscopic image, we can see that they're very basophilic. That means that they're kind of blue under the H&E stain, right? This basophilia means that there is protein synthesis, okay? Now the clear areas in the cytoplasm, so here, if you look here, you can see that there's like basophilic parts, those are protein synthesis. The clear parts of it are for the Golgi apparatus, which are involved in packaging and secreting the matrix, all right? Now, the chondrocytes, they're very active when they produce a lot of ECM, especially during growth, and because cartilage, and we're going to discuss this in a bit, because cartilage is avascular, meaning it doesn't have its own blood supply, they rely on something called anaerobic glycolysis. I'm sure you guys took it. Now let's talk about the matrix in and of itself. So we talked about the cells, now let's talk about the matrix, okay? Now, the matrix, you have, you have two types of matrix. You have something called territorial matrix and you have something called interterritorial matrix. What is the difference? Now, when you have H&E staining, tamam, you're going to see that there are some parts of the matrix that appear darker than others. Why? Because the parts that are darker are going to have higher levels of something called proteoglycan. Remember how we said that the ECM is made up of fibers and ground substance? Proteoglycans are part of the ground substance, okay? And the lighter areas, they reflect higher levels of fibers, so more fibers. Fibers like collagen, okay? And lower concentrations of proteoglycan. Now, the territorial matrix is the one that is dark staining and it's immediately around the chondrocytes, whereas the interterritorial matrix is between the territorials. So territorial is like the territory basically around the chondrocytes, and interterritorial is between these little territories. Okay? And they're lighter staining and they're collagen rich and they have like less proteoglycan. Now, let's talk about the extracellular matrix. Now, you're probably wondering why I have a picture of noodles and hot dogs here, but um, it's gonna make sense in a second. So we have the extracellular matrix. Remember how we said it's made up of fibers and ground substance? What are the fibers? The fibers are the type 2 collagen, okay? In cartilage, it's type 2 collagen, all right? The ground substance, it's made up of GAGs or glycosaminoglycans, which are chondroitin sulfate, keratin sulfate, and hyaluronic acid. We're going to find a way to remember these in a second, okay? But I just want you to keep in mind this kind of analogy, all right? So here we have the cartilage. You'll have the collagen fibers, the chondrocytes, and the light blue is all extracellular matrix or ground substance, okay? So if we take one of these, like the ground substance and we zoom in on it, we're going to see the glycosaminoglycans. Now, they're not just randomly placed, they are organized, okay? So what is this bowl of noodles doing here? I want you to think of the bowl of noodles as cartilage, okay? So cartilage is the bowl of noodles. The hot dogs are the cells, the chondrocytes, okay? The noodles are the fibers, and the broth is the ground substance, okay? Now, when you're making any good bowl of noodles, you just throw in the spices and just hope for the best. I hope not. So, there's kind of a recipe to the proteoglycans, to the gags when they're like formed in the cartilage. Okay, so you have the gags, okay? Uh, Specifically chondroitin and keratin sulfate. Um, let's take a look at this image, okay? You'll have chondroitin sulfate, which is the small red fibers, and keratin sulfate, the small blue fibers. They come together and they connect to something called a core protein, which is kind of like this big protein in the middle, all right? And this will form something called a monomer. Mono means one, right? So these monomers, this is just one part of the major picture, one part of the aggregates, okay? This monomer is going to, like a bunch of different monomers are going to come together and through something called a link protein, like you'll see it here, this green protein. Okay, same thing on this image. This green protein is called a link protein. So you're going to have the monomers, they bind through the link proteins to something called hyaluronic acid. Okay, and this is like kind of like the backbone. So if you think of it, it's kind of like a skeleton. And these form the aggregates. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these aggregates are very, very, very negatively charged. And when something is very, very electrically charged, what does it do? It attracts water, okay? And this gives cartilage its resilience, and the ability to absorb shock because it's like kind of cushioned by the water. So again, you have chondroitin sulfate, keratin sulfate, core protein, monomer. Monomer, link protein, hyaluronic acid, okay? And they come together to form the proteoglycan aggregates. Now, let's go on. This is another picture, okay? You have the chondroitin sulfate, keratin sulfate, link protein, and the protein core, and then it comes together and binds to hyaluronic acid. And one of these units is called a proteoglycan monomer. Now, this is just a general summary of what we've talked about so far. Cartilage is chondrocytes plus extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix is fibers and ground substance. The fibers are type 2 collagen. The ground substance is the glycosaminoglycans. Now, the glycosaminoglycans, specifically chondroitin sulfate and keratin sulfate, they come together with the core proteins and they make, excuse me, proteoglycan monomers. Proteoglycan monomers and hyaluronic acid through link proteins, they're going to make aggregates, okay? Now, let's talk about the perichondrium. Now, if you remember, I mentioned a little bit earlier that the cartilage doesn't have its own blood supply, right? Now, how does it get its nutrients? Well, the nutrients come from something called the perichondrium. Now, peri means around, something that is around something, okay? Chondrium, like we know, it's cartilage. So the perichondrium is a layer of dense and irregular connective tissue, and it surrounds the surface of most cartilage. It's really, really important, okay, for the growth of cartilage because it supplies it with nutrients. Now, the perichondrium has two layers, an outer fibrous layer and an inner cellular layer. The outer fibrous layer, okay, is going to be type 1 collagen fibers and fibroblasts. And it has blood vessels that will supply nutrients to the cartilage, which is avascular. The intercellular layer, or the chondrogenic layer, will contain the mesenchymal stem cells. Remember the ones that we talked about that make the chondroblasts and then the chondrocytes. And these cells are going to divide and differentiate, like we said, into chondroblasts, and they lie outside the matrix. And when they round up and they become entrapped within the matrix, they're called chondrocytes. Okay, now all of that talk, we're going to look at it in this picture. Here we have the outer fibrous layer of the perichondrium, right? And the intercellular layer of the perichondrium. Now you can see here, these are the mesenchymal stem cells or the chondrogenic cells. These are the chondroblasts. And once they become embedded in the matrix, they become chondrocytes. And here you have mostly type 1 collagen, okay? Type. This is just commenting again on the avascularity. we said that cartilage is avascular, right? So avascular means that it doesn't have its own blood supply. So how does it get its own blood supply? Well, it relies on the perichondrium. The perichondrium, like we said, it has its own blood supply, right? So nutrients will diffuse from the perichondrium into the cartilage, and that will supply the cartilage with its nutrients. Okay? Now, for the reason that the cartilage doesn't have its own blood supply, okay, this is why chondrocytes will have low metabolic activity, okay? And it has limited capacity for repair because it doesn't get its own blood supply, right? So, if it has high metabolic activity, where is it going to get the nutrients from? How is it going to get the nutrients for repair? Where is it going to put all the metabolites, right? So it doesn't have its own blood supply. Okay? Now that we've talked about cartilage, basics of cartilage, let's talk about the basics of bone. Now we know that bone is also a connective tissue, but it's a specialized connective tissue. Why? Because it's calcified. Bone is rigid and it's supportive, okay? Why? Because we have something called mineralization happening. So we have, like we said, like the basics of all connective tissue, we have cells and extracellular matrix. But the difference here is that the extracellular matrix of bone is calcified. What does that mean? It means that we have calcium phosphate in the form of something called hydroxyapatite, which is the mineral that is mineralizing the bone, that's causing it to be very hard and rigid. Now, let's talk about the basic composition of bone in terms of organic and inorganic composition. By weight, bone is about 60% inorganic. Okay, what does that mean? It means that it's like not an organic compound. Okay, so I feel like I just said the obvious, but calcium phosphate is an inorganic compound, and it forms 60% of bone in the form of hydroxyapatite. The other 30% and 10% are made up of organic compounds and water. So organic compounds like type 1 collagen, as well as all the bone cells and all the other types of proteins. And 10% is about 10% is water. Now, what are the roles of minerals and collagen? Now, if you think of it, it makes sense, okay? It'll just come to you if you think of the roles. The roles of minerals, what are they? Okay, so a mineral is hard. So what is the role of something hard in the bone? Well, to provide strength, right? Okay, type it's made up of calcium and phosphate, right? So what does it act as? It acts as a reservoir for calcium and phosphate in the body, and it helps maintain skeletal integrity. So your bones stay together; they don't just dissolve, right? What about collagen? Well, collagen is softer. It's more flexible, right? So what does it do? It provides tensile strength and flexibility. And at the same time, it kind of ties together the minerals, right? So it prevents the bones from being brittle. And collagen and minerals that together they make a strong and durable bone. What about the functional roles of cartilage? So we talked about the basics of the structure. We talked about um what makes bone, what makes cartilage. Now let's talk about the functions of cartilage and bone. First, let's talk about cartilage, okay? First of all, we have cartilage. We know that we have cartilage on the ends of our bones, right? This is really important. Why? Because if you have two bones against each other and they're just like grinding against each other, they're moving constantly, they're just going to break each other because that surface is friction. There's a lot of friction on it. So we have cartilage, which provides smooth and low friction surfaces at synovial joints, and it facilitates like efficient and pain-free movement. All right, and compressibility. It acts as a shock absorber. Remember what we said about the water in cartilage. Now, it also offers flexible support in areas like the ear, the nose, the airway. And also, what we're gonna talk about it later is that it serves as a template for bone formation. So it's not just there in the adult body, it's also there during the fetal development, and it forms a template for bone formation. And elastic cartilage is very flexible. You have elastic cartilage in your ears, your nose, etc. Okay, now resistance and durability. Specifically, we can talk about fibrocartilage. Taban, we're going to discuss each type of cartilage in detail, but this is just an overview. It resists compression and provides tensile strength, and it's found in IV discs. And it's very durable under load because of the high water content and lots of gags. Now, for bone, what are the functional roles of bone? Well, logically, you have bone can provide structural support for the body, right? It allows movement and it protects the internal organs. You have the axial skeleton, right? That protects the heart and the lungs, and the skull protects the brain, right? It also acts as a mineral storage. Why? Because there are essential minerals, like we said, calcium and phosphate, and these can be stored or released depending on what the body needs. And hydroxyapatite gives the bone rigidity. Now, there's another function for bone, and what is that? It's that it's responsible for blood formation or hematopoiesis, and it also has an endocrine role. How is it responsible for hematopoiesis? Remember in foundation, you have within the bone you have bone marrow. Now in the medullary cavity of the bone you have hematopoietic tissue, which produces all types of blood cells. So red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, you name it. And the bone acts as an endocrine organ because it releases hormones such as osteocalcin. I don't think this is important for you to remember, but it's just there in case. And they influence stop-on energy metabolism and other biological processes. Now let's classify cartilage, okay? Cartilage is classified into 3 types based on matrix composition and the mechanical properties. So let's divide it. So first you have hyaline cartilage, then you have fibrocartilage, and then you have elastic cartilage. Like, what does each one of these mean? First of all, hyaline cartilage. You can see this little picture of like a bone. This is the cartilage that covers the ends of your bones, okay? And it contains mostly type 2 collagen, proteoglycans, and GAGs, okay? What about fibrocartilage? Fibrocartilage, it has, on top of hyaline cartilage, it has a lot of type 1 collagen, and this is what makes it very, very strong. It gives it high tensile strength, and you'll find that mostly in the IV discs, the pubic symphysis, and the menisci of the knee, okay? Now you have elastic cartilage, and from the name, it's elastic, so it contains elastic fibers, in addition to hyaline's matrix. So it has type 2 collagen, proteoglycans, and GAGs, and elastic fibers. And you'll find this mostly in the ears, in the nose, and any piece of cartilage basically that you can kind of squish. Now, let's talk about hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type of cartilage, okay? It appears glassy and homogeneous. What does that mean? It means that it looks like kind of whitish on gross anatomy. And it's found mostly in joints, okay? The larynx, trachea, bronchi, and costal cartilage, and the nose. And it functions to resist compression as well as cushion the joints, and it forms the fetal skeleton, okay? Now, for the matrix zones, okay, what are the matrix zones? Remember how we talked about the different colors of the matrix and how there's like one that seems darker, one that seems lighter? Well, here we have basically 3 zones of matrix. You have the capsular zone. Okay, the capsular zone is this one right here, the very dark staining one. It surrounds the cell immediately. And after that, you have the territorial matrix. Like we said, it's full of gags, and that's why it's dark staining. And then you have interterritorial matrix, which is all around, and this is more collagen rich, and that's why it's lighter staining. Now, for the water distribution, if it's tightly bound, it will create osmotic pressure for cushioning. And if it's loosely bound, it'll enable diffusion of metabolites, okay? Now, let's talk about hyaline cartilage, specifically articular cartilage. Articular cartilage is a specific type of hyaline cartilage, and it covers the joint surfaces that can move, okay? And it doesn't have a perichondrium. And that makes sense because if it's like there's a lot of friction happening in that area, then there is going to be a lot of movement, and then having a perichondrium is going to resist that movement. So there's no perichondrium on articular cartilage. Okay, now this is where you can see the articular cartilage. Okay, this is cartilage, and there is no perichondrium. All right, then we have more pictures. So here we have, this is hyaline cartilage, just general hyaline cartilage. You have the perichondrium, the chondroblasts, and you have the isogenous groups of the chondrocytes. This is normal cartilage, normal hyaline cartilage, so it has a perichondrium. However, if we compare it to the articular cartilage, you can see here that there's hyaline cartilage. This is the joint cavity, and you don't have any perichondrium, okay? All right. Now, what are the zones of articular cartilage? Now, if we look at articular cartilage, there are four zones, okay? You have the superficial zone, which is made up of flat chondrocytes, okay? And the collagen is going to be parallel to the surface. So it's superficial, it makes sense that everything is going to be flat, right? It's closest to the friction. Then you have the intermediate zones. The chondrocytes are going to be a little bit more round, and the collagen is going to be kind of all over the place. It's going to be disorganized. However, the deep zone, they're going to be is going to be even more organized. Okay, so it's going to be columns. So it's basically opposite of the superficial zone, and it's going to look like columns of chondrocytes, and the collagen will be perpendicular. And then you have the calcified cartilage, which is it has like a mineralized type of cartilage that basically exists just above the bone, and then it kind of attaches it to the bone. And you have the tide mark. Now we're going to talk about the tide mark in a second. All right, in exactly a second. Here we have the superficial zone, intermediate zone, the deep zone, the calcified zone, and we have the tide mark. What is the tide mark? The tide mark is just exactly what it is, basically the line between the deep zone and the calcified zone, okay? And the cement line will separate calcified cartilage from subchondral bone, and it grows only by interstitial growth. And yeah. Now, let's talk about elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is very similar to hyaline cartilage. The only difference there is that there's just elastic fibers. Now, you can see these elastic fibers here. Okay, there's a lot of elastic fibers that are existing around it. There's also this image, but in purple, and we'll see it in a bit. But yeah, so this is the elastic cartilage. The chondrocytes will sit in their lacuna as usual, and the ECM will contain type 2 collagen and proteoglycans, as well as elastic fibers. And the elastic fibers are going to be very irregularly arranged, and they become visible with Verhoff or Orchin stain, and they provide elasticity. Now, elastic cartilage always has a perichondrium. Like we said, there's an outer fibrous layer, which is type 1 collagen and fibroblasts, and there's an inner cellular layer, which has stem cells and chondroblasts, and they all supply nutrients, like the entire perichondrium will supply nutrients, because by diffusion, because the cartilage is avascular. All right. Now, where are the locations of it? You'll find it in the ear, in the eustachian tube, in the epiglottis, okay? And it provides flexibility, it offers resilience, pliability, which means that it can bend and compress, and it can withstand mechanical stress. So if someone pulls your ears, it's not going to break. Okay, so what about aging? What happens when a person ages with time? Elastic cartilage will not calcify with age. This is different from hyaline cartilage, which will often undergo calcification over time, right? And this is a good thing because you don't want your ears to calcify, right? Now, let's talk about fibrocartilage. So we've talked about hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage. Now let's talk about fibrocartilage. What is fibrocartilage? Fibrocartilage is basically made up of two things, okay? From the name, fibrocartilage. So fibro, it has a connective tissue component, a dense, regular connective tissue component, okay? It's rich in type 1 collagen and fibroblasts, okay? Now, cartilage is the other component, so hyaline cartilage. So it'll have chondrocytes and lacuna, and it'll have type 2 collagen and ECM. So in a nutshell, fibrocartilage is hyaline cartilage and dense regular connective tissue. It's going to have type 1 and type 2 collagen, extracellular matrix, and fibroblasts, as well as chondrocytes. Now we can see it here in this image. You have dense regular connective tissue that's shown. You have fibroblasts, and then if we zoom in on this part here, you have an isogenous group of chondrocytes. Okay, now the fibroblasts, how can you tell the difference? Fibroblasts usually are like very flattened and they swim on their own, whereas isogenous chondrocytes or chondrocytes usually exist in isogenous groups. and they sit in lacuna. Now, let's talk about a different stain. So here we have, I think, an H&E stain, and you'll see that the fibrocartilage kind of has a structure to it. So it's not just random. It has columns, or sorry, rows of chondrocytes. They exist about, okay, and dense irregular connective tissue between them. And the matrix will be acidophilic and it'll stain pink due to the low proteoglycan content, okay? And since there's a lot of type 1 collagen fibers, they're going to compress the chondrocyte groups and they're going to be very tightly packed. Now, fibrocartilage, okay? There is no perichondrium present. So if you remember, hyaline cartilage has a perichondrium, except for articular cartilage, right? Elastic cartilage has a perichondrium. Fibrocartilage does not have a perichondrium, okay? And the matrix contains both type 1 and type 2 collagen. I have a session. Camera. Sorry. Okay. Back to what I was saying. There is no perichondrium. It contains type 1 and type 2 collagen, and there is fibroblasts and type 1 collagen in it, which distinguishes it from hyaline. And because of the large amounts of fibers, they're arranged in rows. All right. And this stuff, like khas, we already mentioned it. You can just read it on your own. All right. What are the locations of fibrocartilage? You have intervertebral discs, like we said, pubic symphysis, menisci of the knee. So any part that connects structures together and will face a lot of pressure will have fibrocartilage because it's very, very strong. Okay, so just remember IV discs, pubic symphysis, and menisci of the knee. And there's also the articular discs of sternoclavicular and temporomandibular joints, but I don't think you need to know that. And entheses, which I also don't think you need to know. Just remember these three. Now, let's talk about the formation of cartilage. So how is cartilage formed, or chondrogenesis? Um, it comes from embryonic mesenchyme. Okay, so embryonic mesenchyme, like we said, is the precursor for all types of cartilage. The mesenchymal stem cells will turn into chondroblasts, and chondroblasts will undergo mitosis. They're going to produce ECM, and then once they're embedded within the ECM, they're going to form isogenous groups of chondrocytes. Okay. Now, let's take a look at this image from your lecture. You have the mesenchymal stem cells, okay? Then those are going to, you can see they have like a lot of projections. So they're going to lose their projections and they're going to form chondroblasts. They're going to become more rounded, all right? They're going to undergo mitosis and then they're going to form ECM, all right? ECM. They're still chondroblasts, but there's a lot of ECM around them. Then they're undergoing mitosis within the ECM to form isogenous groups of chondrocytes. Now, what is appositional growth? Okay, so appositional growth is basically when you have cartilage that's existing and then you just add cartilage on top. So new cartilage on top of the existing cartilage. Now, can this happen on its own? No, it needs a perichondrium. So by logic, hyaline cartilage can undergo appositional growth. Elastic cartilage can undergo appositional growth, but not articular cartilage, not fibrocartilage, right? The chondrogenic cells, remember in the perichondrium, remember how we had two layers? We had the fibrous layer, outer fibrous layer, and the cellular layer. The cellular layer is going to have chondrogenic cells, and those differentiate into chondroblasts, and the chondroblasts are going to secrete matrix on top of the surface, forming a new layer, and then that just keeps happening, and that causes something called appositional growth of the cartilage, okay? There's also interstitial growth, which happens within the mass of the cartilage itself, okay? Now, chondrocytes will divide in their lacuna and they're going to produce new ECM. And the daughter cells, they're initially going to be in the same place, but then they separate as they secrete matrix. And now this type, it does not require perichondrium. So since it does not require perichondrium, we can see it in articular and fibrocartilage. And this contributes to the growth of the epiphyseal plate during bone lengthening. Now, what are the limitations to the repair of cartilage? We talked about cartilage formation, we talked about cartilage growth, now cartilage repair. Now, why does it have such a limited repair capacity? Number one, we said it's avascular, meaning it doesn't have its own blood supply, so it doesn't have enough oxygen and nutrient supply. Number two is that it has a low metabolic rate. That means it doesn't really do much. It's kind of lazy. And because they're immobile, they're kind of fixed in their position and they can't really proliferate. Okay, and the damage to cartilage usually heals slowly and incompletely, especially in adults. Now, how is cartilage repaired? We know the limitations. Now let's talk about the mechanism of repair of cartilage. What is it? First of all, we have progenitor cells that come from the perichondrium. Remember how we said we had the outer fibrous layer and the inner cellular layer. So the inner cellular layer has progenitor cells, and those are going to invade the damaged area and produce new cartilage. All right. Now, in very large injuries, repair will cause a dense connective tissue scar and not cartilage. And in articular cartilage, we don't have perichondrium, so repair is even more limited. And that's why treatments may include grafts, growth factors, and something called artificial matrices. Now, I hope you spotted that, by the way. Now, let's talk about the calcification of cartilage, hyaline and elastic. Now, hyaline cartilage will calcify when calcium phosphate embeds in its matrix. When does that occur? It occurs when bone contacts areas of articular cartilage during endochondral ossification, which we're going to talk about later, and as a part of aging. Sometimes when people just get older, their hyaline cartilage will calcify. Now, calcified cartilage is often replaced by bone, and elastic cartilage does not calcify with aging, as we mentioned before. Fibrocartilage only calcifies during bone repair and not with aging, and it's seen during fracture healing. And usually it has like a low proteoglycan content and doesn't calcify. And if a matrix becomes calcified, then nutrient diffusion is impaired and the chondrocytes will basically die. Now, let's take a look at this image. It basically summarizes everything for you in a table. You have hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage, okay? Now, this was the other image I was talking about, where you can very clearly see the elastic fibers and how they're irregularly irregularly placed and they're surrounding. And you can see there's like a stark difference between hyaline cartilage and elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage is just kind of like the blue stain. And yeah, you can go over this table. It basically summarizes everything for you. Now, clinical star. Remember how we said cartilage repair is limited? Well, what comes into play here is osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis is a type of joint disease, right? It's a degenerative joint disease, and it's one of the most frequent causes of joint pain and disability. So it happens a lot. It's more common than you think. And what happens here is that there is generally a degradation of articular cartilage. So the articular cartilage just starts to break down, okay? And it's no longer strong enough, right? So it's linked to aging, mechanical stress, and inflammation. And what does it lead to? First of all, the surface erosion of the bone, and bone exposure. It can also lead to thinning of the cartilage and pain, lots and lots of pain and joint stiffness. There's another clinical star, and it's the chondrosarcoma. So what is a chondrosarcoma? Remember how we said we have cartilage producing cells, right? So chondrosarcoma is a malignant tumor of cartilage producing cells, and it's usually a slow growing tumor. And it doesn't metastasize, okay? But treatment is surgical. So that's all you need to know. Malignant tumor of cartilage producing cells, slow growing, does not metastasize, and treatment is surgical. And if you get this image, just kind of know it's chondrosarcoma. Now, checkpoint. Take a deep breath, have a 2-minute break, have a sip of water. Okay, so we're back. Let's talk about bone. Okay, so we finished talking about cartilage mostly. Now let's talk about bone. I want you to think of a long bone, like your femur, okay, as something like a hollow tube, and it has thick walls, all right? Now, what makes up the walls? The outer shell is made up of something called the cortex, okay, and that's made up of compact or cortical bone, and it gives the bone its like strength, all right? Now, what's inside of the tube? So we said that the outside is cortical bone. The inside of the tube, there are three things. There is trabecular bone, which you can see here, or spongy bone. It looks like a sponge. There is marrow between the trabecula, between the spongy bone, and there's also blood vessels and nerves, okay? And the marrow can be either fatty or uh, hematopoietic. So it can be red marrow or yellow marrow, which is usually found here. Now, how about the ends of the bone? At the epiphyses, okay, this is the epiphysis. You'll find that the cortical bone, okay, you know how here in the diaphysis you have like lots and lots of cortical bone. Eventually, when you reach the epiphysis, okay, it'll start to thin out, and instead it'll have a transition into spongy bone. Now, the spongy bone it has trabecula, and these are kind of like the inside of a sponge. All right, so like we said, the cortex is composed of compact or cortical bone. The medullary cavity will contain trabecular bone or cancellous bone, same thing. And it'll have red or yellow marrow, and it'll have blood vessels and nerves. So the outside is kind of like a pipe, and the inside is filled with marrow. And at the ends, the epiphyses, the cortical bone will transition to trabecular bone, and it'll have marrow within the trabecular bone or like between the trabecula. And then you can see in this image, you have the outside, you have the cortical bone, and on the inside, you have the um the trabecular bone. So cortical bone, trabecular bone. And the same thing here, and this is just an X-ray. Okay, so that's just like the general classification of bone. Now, how do we histologically classify or categorize bone under a microscope? So, how is it classified? It's basically based on how type 1 collagen fibers are arranged. We have woven bone and we have lamellar bone based on the um, organization of collagen. Woven bone, from the name, it's like kind of woven into each other. So it kind of looks like a nest, right? So the collagen fibers are going to be very disorganized. And we'll usually see this in fetal development and fracture healing or in early bone formation. It's very fast to produce because it's just you're just throwing collagen and calling it a day. But it's very weak. So it's fast to produce, but it's weak. However, lamellar bone, okay, is organized into layers. And layers, we call them lamellae. Okay? Lamellae. And the collagen be arranged stacked on top of each other. So they're going to be parallel or they're going to be concentric. So they're going to be like around each other, like kind of the rings of a tree. And they're found in adult bone, and they're strong and more durable than the woven bone. And most of your bone is going to be lamellar. So if you look here, this is the woven bone. It looks like the collagen fibers are very messy. You can see they're very disorganized. However, here it looks very smooth, kind of almost like straight hair. It looks like very, very smooth, very parallel to each other. So that's lamellar bone. No. Bone can be divided. So we divided it histologically. Now let's talk about it from an architectural kind of organ like point of view. So by density and by function. So we have cortical bone or compact bone, and we have trabecular or spongy bone. So this is cortical bone. It's in the diaphysis of the bone. And here you have the epiphysis. It's kind of a thin layer of cortical bone with trabecula on the inside. So cortical bone is going to be very dense and solid, and it makes up most of your bone mass. And it's the type of bone that provides strength and support. However, the trabecular bone is more porous. You can see it's full of pores and it's very lightweight, and it makes up a smaller percentage of your bone mass, and it contains the bone marrow, and this is the site of bone marrow and remodeling, so it's going to be very metabolically active. Okay, now how are bones architecturally arranged? Um, long bones, okay. In long bones, you have the diaphysis. Like we said, almost all of it is cortical bone. The epiphysis and metaphysis are mostly trabecular bone, and they have a thin cortical shell. So here, the diaphysis is mostly cortical bone, and here you have a thin layer of cortical bone with lots of trabecula on the inside. As for short bones, like your carpals and metacarpals, you're going to have, it's going to look like this. This is going to be the bone. You have a compact shell and you have a spongy bone on the inside. Tamam? And in flat bone, it's going to be kind of like a sandwich. It's going to be two layers of compact bone, and trabecular bone is going to be in the middle. Now, how is bone so strong? Like we said, there's two types of bone. There's lamellar bone and there's woven bone. Most of your bone is lamellar, right? So what makes it so strong? Lamellar bone, basically, it's the organized and mature form of bone found in adults. So whether it's cortical, trabecular, most of the bones in your body as an adult are organized into lamellae. So they're in thin layers that are either parallel or concentric. Okay, so what do they look like? Usually, they can be organized in two ways, either in parallel sheets, so like you can see here, they're parallel on top of each other, or concentric, in something called a Haversian system or an osteon. Okay, so it looks kind of like a tree, like you cut open a tree, it looks like that, or like an onion, for example. Um, what's inside of each lamella? So you have type 1 collagen fibers. They're packed inside all the lamella, and it makes sense that since they're all very organized, that they would be packed in one direction. So they're aligned in one direction per layer. But in different lamella, so one lamella compared to another lamella, it would be in alternate directions, okay? Why does it have alternate directions? Because it will resist bending and twisting and all angles. Okay? Um, think of it kind of like compared to a woven bone, or like woven, okay. Think of it kind of like a woven fabric, okay, that can't really easily tear because the threads are in all directions, so you try to like pull it apart, it doesn't pull apart, okay? Um, okay. Now, the Haversian system, okay? This is the part that you guys have been waiting for. What is an osteon? An osteon is basically the basic structural unit of mature cortical bone. So, it's kind of like a cylinder, and it runs through the bone. That's basically what an osteon is. And this osteon, okay, it uh it looks like this, okay? It kind of looks like a roll of paper, if you will. It contains a central Haversian canal. This is the Haversian canal, and that Haversian canal will contain blood vessels, arteries, veins, nerves, all of that, okay? And then around it, you'll have a bunch of lamellae, which are concentric, meaning that they are in circles, okay? And within each lamellae, you're going to have the collagen fibers, right? And between the lamellae, you're going to have osteocytes. They sit in spaces called lacuna. Remember how we had lacuna in the cartilage? We also have lacuna in the bone. So the osteocytes are going to sit in lacuna between each lamellae. And they're going to form little connections with each other, okay, called canaliculi, which let the osteocytes to communicate with each other, and they get nutrients as well. Okay, now, um, you might be thinking, okay, so cool, osteons. What's next? Well, osteons, technically, it's important to know that they're not isolated. How are they not isolated? They talk to each other, and they talk to each other through two different channels, basically. They have canaliculi, which we mentioned before. You have the osteocyte sitting in its lacuna with its canaliculi, and you can see it's kind of connecting it to the other osteocytes. And you also have something called the Volkmann's canals or the perforating canals that run transversely. Okay, so you have these are the Volkmann's canals. Okay, and you have, like we said, the canaliculi, they run from each osteocyte. Okay, so yeah. Sorry, is this the same slide? Okay, so here you have the canal systems. These are real histology images. Let's look at this one. This is a Volkmann canal connecting one osteon to the next. This is an osteon, just a singular osteon. You can see the central canal, you can see the lamellae, right? And between each lamellae, you have the sites sitting in the lamellae, and you can see kind of the kind of, it looks like hair. Those are the canaliculi between each one. Now here you have an up close picture of the osteocytes, and that gives you the canaliculi. Here you can see them, and gap junctions will pass through the canaliculi. Now that we've finished talking about that, I want you to think of it as a plumbing system. You have the Haversian canal, which is like the main pipe, and then you have the canaliculi, which are kind of like small side pipes delivering to each house, and similarly the Volksmann's canals. Now let's talk about trabecular bone. So we're done talking about lamellar bone or cortical bone. Okay, now let's talk about trabecular bone. Um, Trabecular bone is a type of lamellar bone, and it doesn't have like the full osteon organization. It's still lamellar bone, but it doesn't have the Haversian systems, okay? And primarily, like we said, it's found in the vertebra, the epiphyses, the metaphysis of long bones. And like we said here, like in the epiphysis, the metaphysis, okay, in the trabecula. And it's made up of like small, thin, kind of interconnected trabecula, and they form a supportive network around the marrow-filled spaces, all right? And the nutrients will diffuse through the trabecula due to their thinness and the blood vessels that run through the medullary cavity. Now, they have a very porous structure. Okay, you can see here, these are the trabecula, and then those are the marrow spaces. Here, the trabecula, the marrow spaces. They're very porous, and the marrow will fill the interconnected spaces, and they need to maintain a specific balance of plates and rods for mechanical integrity. All right. Now, let's talk about bone cells and bone remodeling. What are bone cells? Bone cells, I want you to think of them as construction workers, okay? They're working on a construction site. We have three main types of bone cells. First, we have osteoblasts, okay? We have osteocytes and we have osteoclasts. Osteoblasts are the builders, so B builders, and they're stationed at the bone surface. Osteocytes are like the supervisors, so sites supervisors. They're embedded in the concrete. And osteoclasts are the demolition team. Now, clast, kassar, so taksir, so clast are the ones that break down old bone. Now, what are osteoblasts? Like we said, osteoblasts come from mesenchymal stem cells via osteoprogenitors. So, like we said, mesenchymal stem cells form osteoblasts, and osteoblasts become osteocytes later on. They are responsible for laying down the organic framework, mostly type 1 collagen. They work in like single file lines, so they're like a construction crew, and they lay bricks along a wall. They always operate on the surface, and they're never buried inside of the bone. Because if they get buried inside the bone and the bone is very mineralized, then how's it going to create more bone, right? And they stay connected via gap and adherence junctions to coordinate their activity. So it's important to remember that osteoblasts, they don't just work on their own. No, they need to coordinate their activity together, so they stay connected by gap junctions and adherence junctions. Now, osteoblasts, if we look at them, these are the osteoblasts, okay? And this is the matrix that they're forming. So the osteoid is called osteoid, and these are the next cells that are coming up are the osteoclasts, okay? So these are the osteoblasts. You can see them here. They're kind of on the surface of the bone. They're forming the osteoid, which is the organic matrix, and this is the osteoclast. And then on the schematic image here, you can see this is the osteoblast, and this is the osteoid, and this is kind of the calcified bone. Now, osteoblasts, how do they work? They're the builders, right? So what they're going to do is that they're going to kind of lay down the first layer. What is that layer? It's like kind of like a soft foundation layer before they harden the final structure. All right. It's going to be kind of like a wet cement of bone. It's not hardened yet, so it's going to be very collagen-rich osteoid. And it's deposited between the osteoblasts and the existing bone. So you have the osteoblast, the existing bone, and between it, the osteoid. And that's going to be collagen-rich. It's kind of like wet cement. It stains very lightly, as you can see here, and it's not mineralized yet. Later, it becomes mineralized, and it forms mature bone. Now, osteoblasts will use wired connection or communication like network devices. And like we said, these are the cytoplasmic processes that link the osteoblasts together and to osteocytes, and they're connected via gap junctions, and this enables real-time coordination between the cells. Now, what is the fate of osteoblasts? Dun dun dun. After building is done, these workers, like we said, they're going to either leave the site or they're going to take on new roles. So what does that mean? That means that sometimes osteoblasts, yani haram, they get locked inside their own matrix and they become osteocytes. Okay, so they take on a new role. Others, they flatten out and they become bone lining cells. And most of them basically just die. So some of them get locked inside their own matrix, some of them die, and some of them become bone lining cells. Now, osteocytes are kind of like, now let's talk about osteocytes. So we talked about osteoblasts. Now let's move on to osteocytes. What are osteocytes? They're basically, they come from osteoblasts that get trapped in the matrix. And what do? They act as permanent sensors that are embedded in the concrete of the bone, right? They reside in lacuna. Remember how we had the concentric lamellae and we had the osteocytes, and they used to sit in lacuna, right? And they have extensions called canaliculi, which are like the hair-like fibers here. And these extensions, they help the osteocytes communicate with each other. And they're not made for building, they're just made for communication. Now here you have another image. They kind of have the canaliculi, um, more canaliculi, and they have gap junctions that go through the canaliculi. More pictures of osteocytes. Like we said, they act as mechanical sensors and they detect load, they detect micro cracks, and they trigger repair responses by activating osteoblasts or osteoclasts. Now, what are osteoclasts? Okay, osteoclasts, like we said, see, kasr. They are the demolition team. They are large cells that break down old bones. So I want you to think of him as this big guy. So whenever you see the big cell, okay, the big cell, this is the big guy. It's the osteoclast. And they reside in something called house ship's lacuna. So it's kind of like a ship. They sit in their own little ship. And they're very shallow pits, and which they carve out themselves. So they carve out the little pits that they sit in. And they have something called a ruffle border. And the ruffled border is it's kind of like, how do I explain it? It's a textured surface basically, and it has like a high surface area that is made for active resorption. It creates something called a sealing zone. Okay, so this is also a osteoclast. So this is an osteoclast, this is an osteoclast, and this is an osteoclast. Now it's important to remember that osteoclasts are not from mesenchymal stem cells. They come from monocytes. And monocytes are like, they are immune cells from the blood. They fuse together and they form multinucleated cells, which are the osteoclasts. Now, how do osteoclasts resorb the bone? They act kind of like a high efficiency tool head, kind of like a chainsaw, if you will, for breaking down material. So what do? They basically they seal onto the area that they're going to resorb, and they form something called a sealing zone. Okay. and it locks the cell tightly onto the bone, so it kind of like seals it. Yeah. And in this area, the ruffle border is going to release acids and enzymes, and those are going to dissolve the minerals, degrade the organic matrix. Now, how do they resorb the bone? It's kind of like taping off a work site, so it creates kind of like a protected zone for focused work. So the osteoclast will sit on top of the bone matrix, is going to create a sealing zone, and that sealing zone is going to kind of like might cause like the perfect conditions for the osteoclast to resorb bone. So it's going to pump protons to dissolve the hydroxyapatite, and then the enzymes are going to clean up any organic debris. So the summary is that osteoblasts are the builders, osteoclasts are the demolishers, and osteocytes are the supervisors. Now, let's talk about bone remodeling, okay? Let's just take a general look or an overview. There's constant or continuous replacement of old bone with new bone throughout the life. And it has two processes, bone resorption and bone formation, right? So you have a balance between these two processes, bone breakdown and bone formation. And it occurs in both cortical and trabecular bone. And the purpose of it is to repair any micro damages that happen. When you exercise, for example, or when you're walking, there's like micro fractures that happen in your bone. So if those just were to keep happening, then your body would just break down, right? So we need to have a repair system or a remodeling system, and that's done by bone remodeling. And it's also done to maintain calcium homeostasis. So whenever you need calcium in your body just goes and kind of steals some calcium from the bone. And it's regulated by mechanical stress, so detected by the osteocytes, hormones, and cytokines and growth factors. Now, okay, is this the same slide? Okay, apologies. So remodeling will occur within compact bone and it'll form new osteons. And how does it happen? It happens by something called a bone remodeling unit, where you have two cones. You have a cutting cone and a closing cone. So something that goes in and kind of like chews the bone, and then something that comes after and closes whatever is being chewed up. So you have the osteoclasts are going to, well, actually, let's go to the picture. Here, you have the osteoclasts. They're going to go in and they're going to chew up the bone. All right. And then the osteoblasts are going to come in after and they're going to form the bone. And the bone is going to mineralize and then it's going to form new bone. Right. Now, if you look here, you have the osteoclasts. Okay. They're going to chew up the bone. And then after they chew it up, okay, the osteo, sorry, here, we start here. Osteoclasts, they're chewing up the bone. Okay, and then osteoblasts are going to deposit new bone. All right. So that is the direction of the cutting cone movement. It's coming this way, and the closing cone will come right after it. So let's go back here. Osteoclasts are going to resorb the bone by creating a resorption cavity, which is a cutting cone. And then the tunnel is enlarged to match the size of the future osteon, and the blood vessels are going to enter and occupy the canal. And then you're going to have osteoblasts that deposit osteoid in lamellae, and the canals will narrow to become a mature haversian canal, and old osteons will shift position and become interstitial lamellae. So here you have the new osteon being formed, right? The new osteon being formed. And then you have the old osteon becoming basically the interstitial lamellae. This is another picture where you have the cutting cone moving in this direction, and then you have the closing cone moving right after it. And then here, this is just what it looks like when you have like osteons, and then this bone kind of has microfractures, so you have another osteon built on top of it, and then another osteon, etc. Now, mineralization. What is mineralization? It's the inorganic hardening of the organic bone matrix, and it involves the deposition of calcium phosphate nanocrystals, which are basically hydroxyapatite. Now, the osteoblasts are going to secrete for bone mineralization. What's going to happen? Like we said, osteoblasts, they're going to come and they're going to secrete matrix vesicles containing something called ALP, which is alkaline phosphatase. Now, what happens is that these vesicles are going to act as basically main sites for the formation or precipitation of calcium phosphate. And these crystals are going to form within the collagen and they're going to begin to expand. And the result is the formation of hydroxyapatite crystals, giving bone its hardness. So if we look at it here, you have these two images are basically the same image but upside down. You have the osteoblasts. They're going to release something called matrix vesicles. Okay, so it's going to release matrix vesicles, and then there's going to be mineralization. These matrix vesicles, they form like kind of like a center for the mineralization of bone. So there's going to be deposition of the calcium phosphate. Okay, and it's going to cause mineralization around the vesicles, and then the matrix becomes confluent between the vesicles and it forms the mineralized bone. Again, you have the secretory vesicles in the osteoblast. They come up and then there's going to be mineralization around it, and then there's going to be even more mineralization around. So what is the summary of bone remodeling? Is that you have an organic component, which comes from the osteoblast. It's going to be type 1 collagen. You have the inorganic compound, which is hydroxyapatite, which comes after the osteoblasts secrete ALP. And then you have mineralization the mineralization always occurs after osteoid deposition inside the osteons between collagen fibers. Now, what are the bone coverings? There are some prefixes that you need to know. You have peri, which means middle or around, and endo, which means inside, which we discussed earlier. Now, bone is covered by, on the outside is covered by covering, and on the inside is covered by another covering. On the outside is covered by periosteum, so around, and on the inside is covered by endosteum, which is on the inside, right? Now, it's covered by periosteum on all surfaces except the joint surfaces, which are instead covered by cartilage, and on the inside it's covered by endosteum. Now, yeah, that's it for this slide. Now, what is the periosteum? Like we said, it's very similar to the perichondrium, okay? It has outer fibrous layer and it has an intercellular layer. The outer fibrous layer is dense connective tissue, and the intercellular layer has the osteoprogenitor cells. Now, when we have bone growth, the inner layer, the intercellular layer, is thicker, and the collagen fibers will be running parallel to the surface. Now there are some fibers called Sharpie's fibers, which will anchor the periosteum to the bone by embedding into the matrix. So they'll go through the bone. They're like they connect the periosteum to the bone like that. Now the endosteum, this is the endosteum, it's the inner covering of the bone, and it has very thin connective tissue layer. It's a very thin connective tissue layer. It lines the marrow cavity and it covers the tuberculi of spongy bone. It will contain osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, and bone lining cells. And that is checkpoint number 2. Let's take a break. Okay, and we are back. Now let's talk about, oops. Now let's talk about the pathways of bone formation. Okay, osteogenesis. Osteogenesis is bone formation, and it can happen in 2 different ways. It can happen intramembranous and endochondral. Okay, what is intramembranous ossification? It means that the bone comes directly from the differentiation of mesenchyme. It comes from differentiation of mesenchyme to osteoblasts, and this happens in flat bones like the scapula, the skull, the sternum. Now, for endochondral ossification, the bone will develop within a hyaline cartilage template. So it'll come from long bones, the femur, the humerus, etc. All right, so it comes from a hyaline cartilage template. Now, what happens in intramembranous ossification? It begins in the 8th week of gestation. Okay, what happens is that you'll have mesenchymal cells. They'll come together, and they'll sit in the area where the bone is going to form. They're going to differentiate. So what are they going to do? They're going to differentiate into osteoprogenitor cells, and become osteoblasts, okay? So they're going to start secreting osteoid, and the osteoid is going to calcify, and capillaries are going to develop between the bone-forming regions. So you have the osteoid and the capillaries coming together. So this is intramembranous ossification, which means that it comes from the mesenchymal cells, and these mesenchymal cells are going to differentiate into osteoprogenitor cells, which are going to become osteoblasts, and the osteoblasts are going to secrete osteoid, and the osteoid is going to calcify, and then capillaries will come in. All right? Okay, so this is a picture of intramembranous ossification. I'm going to be fully honest with you, I actually don't know what you're supposed to see in this image, but just know it in case it comes in the exam. It's intramembranous ossification. All right. Okay, now let's take a look at this picture. Here you have, this is a picture of intramembranous ossification. Here you have the mesenchymal cells, they're coming together, and then you have they differentiate into osteoblasts, into osteoprogenitor cells, and then osteoblasts. And the osteoblasts are going to lay down osteoid, and they're going to calcify and form bone. And these are the blood vessels that come within the intramembranous ossification. So the final structure is that you have woven bone that's replaced by compact and trabecular bone, and any remaining mesenchyme will become osteum. Now, let's talk about endochondral ossification. This is the one that people usually find more confusing. What happens is that you have mesenchymal cells, okay? You start with mesenchymal cells عادي. They turn, instead of turning into osteoblasts, they turn into chondroblasts, okay? And they're going to form a hyaline cartilage model. So here you start with a hyaline cartilage model. And what happens is that it looks kind of like the bone that it's going to form in the future. Now, what happens is that kind of there's going to be something called a bone collar. It's kind of like a constriction that forms around the diaphysis of the bone. Okay, remember how we said endochondral usually happens in long bones? So there's going to be diaphysis, and there's going to be a bone collar forming around the diaphysis from the perichondrium to the periosteum. And the collar is going to like decrease all the nutrient diffusion, so it's going to impair it. So all the chondrocytes in the center are going to start dying, and they're going to like grow in size, they're going to hypertrophy and die, and then the matrix will calcify and the blood vessels will begin to invade, and they'll bring osteoprogenitor cells, which are going to lay down bone. So here, this is a picture, okay, of endochondral ossification. What you have here is the hyaline cartilage, okay? You have the cartilage, the chondrocytes, okay? The cartilage matrix, which is between the hyaline cartilage, the cells, and you have here the perichondrial bone, okay? Which is the bone collar that is forming here. And this is the joint cavity, which is the future joint. Now, this is another picture of endochondral ossification. Here you have the formation of the bone collar. Okay, and here you have the hyaline cartilage in the center. Now, we have ossification centers in endochondral bone. But before we discuss that, let's talk about, wait, let's take a look at this picture. We have fetal hyaline cartilage, okay? It's a model. It looks like the future bone, right? So what's going to happen is that the cartilage is going to calcify right on the outside, and this is what's going to form the periosteal bone collar. Okay, it forms around the diaphysis, and the cartilage is going to hypertrophy, and then it's going to die, and then this starts the formation of something called a primary ossification center in the diaphysis. All right, and then you have secondary ossification centers which form in the epiphysis, and then what's going to happen is that the bone will begin to replace the cartilage, okay, except in the articular cartilage and the epiphyseal plate. Okay, and the epiphyseal plates, eventually when the person grows up, after خلاص يعني after puberty, after everything, the epiphyseal plates are going to eventually they're going to ossify or calcify and form epiphyseal lines. Okay, so let's go back here. We have the primary ossification center, which is going to be on the inside here in the diaphysis, and you have the secondary centers which are in the epiphysis, okay? Chondrocytes, like we said, they're going to enlarge, and it's going to lead to calcified cartilage. Now, if osteoblasts deposit bone on cartilage, then you have something called mixed spicules, and we're going to talk about that right now. What are mixed spicules? Basically, whenever you have osteoprogenitor cells, they're going to become osteoblasts whenever they contact calcified cartilage spicules, okay? And um, these osteoblasts are going to secrete osteoid onto the cartilage scaffold, and the result is that you have a structure that looks like this. You have an inner core and you have an outer layer. The inner core is made up of calcified cartilage, okay, and the outer layer is going to look like going to be newly deposited bone. The calcified cartilage is going to be light blue stain, and the bone is going to be deep blue stain. And this is basically something called the Mallory stain. Okay, we already discussed this. Now, two cartilage zones will remain, like we said, after this area. There's going to be two cartilage zones. There's going to be articular cartilage and the epiphyseal cartilage. And the epiphyseal cartilage will allow the growth of the bone longitudinally until it fuses in adulthood. Now, let's talk about the epiphyseal cartilage zones. Oops. The epiphyseal cartilage zones, okay? What are the zones of the epiphyseal cartilage? First, we have the zone of reserve cartilage, which is this zone. Then we have the zone of proliferation. Then we have the zone of hypertrophy. Then we have the zone of calcified cartilage. And finally, we have the zone of ossification, or the zone of resorption. Same thing. Now let's talk about each one in detail. First of all, you have the zone of reserve cartilage. And here you have sleeping chondrocytes. They're resting. There's no proliferation, there's no matrix production, and it's basically like a supply pool. Okay? Then you have the zone of proliferation. The zone of proliferation is where you have chondrocytes that are dividing rapidly. They're growing, they're proliferating, right? And they're arranged kind of in vertical columns, and they produce matrix proteins and type 2 collagen. Then you have the zone of hypertrophy. This is the zone where the cells begin to hypertrophy, they begin to grow in size, and they secrete something called VEGF, which will attract blood vessels to them. Okay, and the matrix is going to be compressed into linear bands. And then you have the zone of calcified cartilage, um, which is going to be where the hypertrophic chondrocytes begin to die, and the matrix becomes calcified, and they form a scaffold for bone formation. Then you have the bone resorption, or the zone of ossification, and this is where the capillaries and the osteoprogenitor cells finally invade, and finally osteoblasts are going to deposit osteoid onto the cartilage, and then after that they're going to form mixed spicules, which are calcified cartilage and new bone. So this is the growth of this is the growth of the epiphyseal cartilage. You have the zone of reserve cartilage, which is just normal cartilage, zone of proliferation, where the cells begin to grow and they begin to increase in number and they form columns, and then the zone of hypertrophy, where they grow in size. All right, then the zone of calcified cartilage, and then the zone of ossification, where the osteoprogenitor cells come in and osteoblasts come in and they form the mixed spicules. Okay. Now let's talk about the longitudinal growth of bone. Um, it happens by, like we said, the epiphyseal plate growth. So what happens is that, like we said, the chondrocytes will be in the hypertrophic zone. They're going to swell and then they're going to die, and the matrix is going to calcify, and the osteoblasts will lay bone on the calcified cartilage, and then new cartilage is added to the epiphyseal side, and this is basically a balance between proliferation from the top and destruction from the bottom. And it's also important to note that the plate will maintain its thickness, but it shifts upwards as the bone lengthens. And the growth plate development is regulated by growth hormone, sex steroids, and VEGF and bone morphogenic protein. Okay, this is just another picture. Now, this process is called the process of circumferential growth of bone. So instead of longitudinal, it's circumferential. It's called oppositional growth, and it does not involve endochondral ossification. What happens here is that the osteoblasts, they're going to come from the periosteum, and they're going to deposit new bone on the outer surface. Remember how we said in cartilage that the appositional growth, it happens on the surface? The same thing here. It happens on the outer surface. So the bone will grow outwards, increase in diameter, and the osteoclasts in the endosteum will resorb bone from the inner surface. So this causes the medullary cavity to increase. So as you're adding bone from the inside, there's going to be bone resorption from, sorry, you're adding bone on the outside, there's going to be bone resorption from the inside. So this widens the medullary cavity. And the result is that the bone becomes thicker and stronger. So on the outside, here you're adding bone on the outside, so you're adding bone, but at the same time, you're breaking down the bone on the inside. And this is what happens when someone grows with age, like from an infant to adult, and you can see that. And this picture, it compares endochondral ossification with intramembranous ossification. One more time, you have the mesenchymal stem cells, they proliferate and they condense together, and then they differentiate into osteoblasts, and they're going to secrete osteoid, and then they're going to be vascularized, and then they're going to be mineralized, and that's it. And then you have the endochondral, you have the hyaline form or the model for the formation, okay, or for the bone shape, and then there's going to be a center of hypertrophy, so they're going to be hypertrophic, and then they're going to die, and then there's going to be calcification, or sorry, there's going to be ossification, sorry, by osteoblasts, and then there's going to be calcification. You're going to have the diaphysis, the appearance of primary and secondary ossification centers, and finally the mature structure of bone, where you have a growth plate and the articular cartilage as remnants. Now let's talk about the bone supply, uh, bone blood supply. What are the main arteries? You have the nutrient artery, okay? You have, which is this one, you have the metaphyseal and epiphyseal arteries, the metaphyseal and the epiphyseal arteries, and the periosteal arteries. And they enter the cortical bone, they enter through the cortical bone, and cortical bone will receive blood supply from the nutrient artery, the smaller periosteal branches, and the blood will reach the medullary cavity and the haversian systems. As for Volkmann's canals, they act as kind of like transverse conduits for the blood vessels, and they connect the periosteal capillaries to haversian canals. And the haversian canals will contain one arterial and one venual or capillary. And finally, we have bone marrow. Bone marrow is found in children and in early development, and it's rich in hematopoietic stem cells, reticular fibers, and cells, and blood vessels. So this is red marrow. Then we have yellow marrow, which replaces red marrow in adults. Mostly it's adipocytes, and it occurs when blood cell production decreases. And finally, the function is that it's essential for nutrient delivery, bone remodeling, and bone health and repair. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So here you have the fatty marrow, you have the blood vessels, and the hematopoietic stem cells. And another checkpoint. So take a deep breath, take a stretch, and we're going to move on to real histological images. And we're back. So now let's move on to the real images, okay? Now, what do you guys think this is? Just pause and then. Okay, so this is hyaline cartilage. Okay, you can see the cells in their lacuna. What about this? This is elastic cartilage. You can see the elastic fibers. They're dark staining and they're irregularly placed throughout. What about this? This one's pretty easy. This is fibrocartilage, right? Giveaway is the stain, but it's because you can see dense connective tissue as well as the cells that are lined kind of in rows. Then what are the labelings on this? So what is P? What is M? What is C? P is perichondrium, M is matrix, and C is chondrocytes. So matrix, chondrocytes, perichondrium. What are the labelings on this picture? So what's this, and what's this? This is the fibroblast. What is this? This is dense regular connective tissue. Oops. And this is the layers. Okay, now what are these? These are osteoclasts. Now what process is this? Endochondral ossification. What are these? You have what is OB? Osteoblast. What is OCL? Osteoclast. And OT is osteoid. Then you have, what is this? This is a trabecula, right? And this is the endosteum. This is the malar bone. Excuse me. This is bone marrow, and this is the fat cell. What is this? This is Volkmann's canal. It connects between one version canal to the next. What are these labelings? Central canal, lamellae, caliculi, osteocytes, and interstitial lamellae. What is shown here? Canaliculi with gap junctions passing through them. What is shown here? This is woven bone. This is lamellar bone. What is shown in this picture? Bone marrow, right? And therefore you have hematopoietic marrow, you have blood vessels, and you have fatty marrow. Now it's time to move on to questions. So let's solve some questions. Now, which of the following types of collagen is most abundant in hyaline cartilage? Now you need to pause in order to answer. Okay, and it's type 2. What is the function of proteoglycan aggregates in cartilage ECM? And it's C. Which of the following features is best to distinguish elastic cartilage from hyaline cartilage? It's C again. It makes sense. Elastic cartilage, elastic fibers. Then you have apologies, I had some technical difficulties. Which statement about cartilage growth is true? And it is, whoops. It is C. Articular cartilage will only grow via interstitial growth. Now, which statement about cartilage is true? Oh, did I copy the same question twice? Apologies. Now, a 70-year-old patient will complain of progressive knee pain and stiffness. Imaging shows joints base narrowing and cartilage erosion, which is the most likely underlying issue. And it's C. Because the articular cartilage is degenerating, so it's lacking perichondrium. And finally, which of the following is true about chondrosarcoma? And it's C. It affects the pelvis and long bones, and it resists radiotherapy. It needs surgical therapy. I'm not sure if this was mentioned, but if it wasn't, then ignore the question. Now, level 1 OSPE. What tissue is this? Identify the tissue type. Hyaline cartilage. Now, what type of collagen is found in this tissue? Type 2 collagen. What are the light staining and dark staining areas? Dark is territorial, light is interterritorial. Now, level 2. What is the tissue? Articular cartilage. What are the zones from superficial to deep? You have superficial, intermediate, deep, and calcified. Which zone contains the tide mark and what does it separate? Well, it is in the deep zone and it separates uncalcified from calcified cartilage. And then we have level 3. So identify the tissue type. This is elastic cartilage. You can very clearly see the elastic tissues, elastic fibers. What staining feature helps in confirming your answer? Like we said, dark staining elastic fibers within the matrix. And finally, what are the two anatomical sites other than the ear where this tissue can be found? In the epiglottis and the eustachian tube. And then for the bone, what type of bone forms the internal spongy structure of long bones and flat bones? Trabecular bone. What is the name of the thin connective tissue that lines the inner surfaces of bone? Endosteum. What fills the space between trabecula and spongy bone? Bone marrow. A 70-year-old woman suffers a fracture after a minimal trauma. The fracture occurred in the vertebral body. What type of bone is most affected? Trabecular bone, because it's weaker. An adult patient has a bone biopsy that shows mostly adipocytes in the marrow. What type of marrow is this? It is yellow marrow. Now, a child is diagnosed with a growth plate disorder affecting chondrocyte proliferation. Which zone of the epiphyseal plate is disrupted? So, chondrocyte proliferation, so the zone of proliferation. A 12-year-old boy has a delayed bone growth. Lab test shows low growth hormone. Which region of the bone is directly affected? What does low growth hormone affect? Epiphyseal plate. Now for question 7, a drug will inhibit osteoclast activity. Which part of bone remodeling will be directly impaired? Bone resorption, because osteoclasts are responsible for bone resorption. Now for the OSB, what is this? What is the lining structure on the inner surface of the trabeculae? And what is its functional role? Well, it is the endosteum, and it lines the internal bone surfaces and contains osteoprogenitor cells, which are involved in bone remodeling. What are the cells that are embedded within the lamellae of the trabecula? You have osteocytes. What fills the space between the trabecula bone marrow? Now, which zone is responsible for chondrocyte enlargement? The zone of hypertrophy. What is the function of the proliferative zone? Well, oops. Dividing and forming columns contributes to bone lengthening. And what happens in the ossification zone? Osteoblasts will deposit bone matrix on the scaffold of calcified cartilage. Okay, now this picture, what are the cells in the cutting cones and what are the cells in the closing cones and what are their roles? Well, the cutting cones are the osteoclasts and they resorb bone, and the closing cones are osteoblasts and they form new bone. What is the function of the cement line that appears around the new osteon? It separates or marks the boundary between new bone and old bone. And which is the canal that is formed at the center of the new osteon, and what does it contain? It's the Haversian canal, and it contains blood vessels and nerves. So now we have finished. There's another checkpoint. Is your brain fried yet, or are you still moving through the fields of knowledge? Okay, now let us move on to muscle. Let's start by explaining. So we're going to cover skeletal muscle development, organization, muscle fiber structure, myofibrils, filaments, sarcoplasmic reticulum and triad system, types of muscle fibers, etc. All of this is going to be covered, inshallah. Now, so how is skeletal muscle developed? Well, during embryonic development, mesenchymal myoblasts, these ones, they are going to come together and they're going to fuse and they're going to form myotubules. And these myotubules are going to have a lot of nuclei. Okay, then the myotubes are going to differentiate to form striated skeletal muscles with the nuclei peripheral instead of central. And some of the myoblasts remain undifferentiated and they become satellite cells, and these become reserve progenitor cells, and they are responsible for the limited regeneration capacity of skeletal muscle. Apologies. Now, what are the prefixes that you need to know for muscle organization? Now, we had peri and endo just a few minutes ago. Peri means middle, endo means inside. What about epi? Epi means on the outside, okay? Now, this is pretty easy. You guys should know this. But the skeletal muscle, it's covered by layers of connective tissue, right? The entire skeletal muscle is covered by epimysium, which is then a layer of dense connective tissue. And then you have perimysium, which covers each fascicle, okay? And this is also dense connective tissue. And then each muscle fiber alone, it is covered by an endomysium, which is the delicate connective tissue. So the summary is that the whole muscle is epimysium, the fascicle is perimysium, and covering the individual fibers is the endomysium. Dense, dense, delicate. Now, the muscle fiber structure. So each skeletal muscle fiber, okay, or muscle cell is something called a multinucleated syncytium. So I always have trouble saying that word, by the way. So let's break that down. Multi, so multiple, nucleated, nucleus, and syncytium, which means it's a long cell-like structure formed by the joining of two or more cells. So you have multiple cells, they come and fuse together, that makes a syncytium. Now, in cross-section, mature muscle fibers are usually polygonal, and the diameter, it's not very important. Now, the length can vary from 1 meter, like the sartorius muscle, to a few millimeters, like the stapedius, which is in your ear. Now, nuclei are going to be located beneath the plasma membrane, and the plasma membrane is called the sarcolemma. No, the sarcolemma is consisting of a plasma membrane and a basal lamina, which is also called the basement membrane. So you have the plasma membrane and you have the basal lamina, right? The basal lamina has an external lamina which hugs the muscle, and it has a reticular lamina, okay, which ties it to the outside. Now let's talk about some definitions. The word sarco means muscle, right? So sarcolemma is a specialized plasma membrane of a muscle fiber. Sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber, and sarcoplasmic reticulum is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum that stores calcium. What about myofibrils, myofilaments, and the sarcomere? You have muscle fibers, which are a single muscle cell. It's long, cylindrical, and multinucleated. So this is or is it? This is a muscle fiber, the entire thing. A myofibril is just bundles of organized myofilaments inside, and myofilaments are the little ones. Like if you take this and zoom it out, this is a myofibril, and within it you have myofilaments. So you have myosin filaments and actin filaments, and they make up the sarcomere, and they're responsible for contraction. So this is the sarcomere. If you take it and zoom it in even more, you have the sarcomere. Now, what is a sarcomere? Sarcomere is the basic functional contractile unit of myofibrils, which means that on a microscopic level, the sarcomere is what makes your muscles contract. Now, the muscle fiber is, I took it and I flipped it here, but a muscle fiber is filled with a lot of myofibrils, right? This is the myofibril, okay? And the myofibrils will extend the entire length of the muscle. Now, each myofibril has a lot of myofilaments. You have thin filaments and thick filaments. Thin filaments are actin and associated proteins, as well as thick filaments, which are myosin proteins. And the myofilaments are organized in a cross-striated pattern, which gives skeletal muscle its appearance. So you have, let's just look at the myofilaments. We have thin filaments and thick filaments. The ones in blue are the most important. But yeah, the thin filaments, you have actin, tropomyosin, troponin, and nebulin and tropomodulin. And for thick filaments, you have myosin 2, which means 2 heavy chains and 2 pairs of light chains. Now, thin filaments, you have actin, which are G-actin monomers that polymerize to form F-actin filaments. You have tropomyosin, which wraps around actin, and it covers the myosin binding sites. So tropomyosin covers the myosin binding sites on actin, okay? Now you have troponin. It has the last 3 letters, okay, nin, So that means it has three components, right? So TNT, TNI, TNC. TNT, okay, troponin T will bind tropomyosin. TNI will inhibit actin-myosin interaction, and TNC will bind calcium, okay? Tropomodulin will cap the free end, okay, or the minus end, and it will stabilize the filament. So tropomodulin, it will stabilize the filament, so it modulates the filament. And nebulin will anchor actin filaments to the Z line. And finally, we have dystrophin, which is a really important one. It links actin to the extracellular matrix. Now keep an eye out for that star. So here we have the thin filaments. We have actin, okay, G-actin molecules coming together to form an F-actin. And then we have tropomyosin, okay, and then we have tropomodulin, which caps it at the end. And then we have the troponin complex. The troponin complex sits on the tropomyosin, so you have TNT, and then you have TNI, which is the inhibitory one, and the TNC, which binds calcium. And you can't really see nebulin in this picture. Now you have the thick filaments, okay? The thick filaments are composed of myosin 2 molecules. You have the head region, the tail region, and the bare zone. The head region contains an actin binding site, which has an ATP binding site with ATPase activity. And it's formed by two light chains. And those two light chains are like coiled together. And they align tail to tail to form the thick filament. Now, the bare zone is the central part of the thick filament that doesn't have any heads. So you have the head, you have the tail, and the bare zone. Okay, the head has an actin binding site, and it has an ATP binding site with ATPase activity. Okay, and the tail region is formed by two light chains. They're coiled together, and the myosin molecules will align tail to form thick filament. Then we have the sarcomere, the banding patterns, or the things that form the striations. Now let's look at it. Here we have the I band. Okay, the I band will contain only thin filaments, which is actin. The A band contains both thick and thin filaments. So the overlapping, it extends from the start to the end of myosin. And then you have the H zone, which is the middle of the A band with only thick filaments, so there's no overlap. Then you have the Z line or the Z disc, which is the boundary of each sarcomere, and it looks like a Z, so it's easy to remember. Then you have the M line, which is the center of the sarcomere, which is where the filaments are linked. So you have the M line, the Z disc, okay, the A band, the H zone, and the I band. تمام. طيب. This is the picture from your slides. So here you have the M line, only the thick filaments, the H band, the A band, the Z line, and where was it? Yeah. Okay, so you have here dystrophin. Remember how we talked about dystrophin? We said that it links actin to extracellular matrix. And we have titin, which is the largest protein in the body, extends from the Z line to the thick filament and M line. So dystrophin links actin to the extracellular matrix. Like, what happens if we have a defect in dystrophin? We have something called Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So dystrophy. Okay, so Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. It's an X-linked recessive disorder, and it's caused by the absence of the dystrophin protein, which normally links actin filaments to the extracellular matrix. And since it's X-linked, it mostly affects males because it's on the X chromosome, and it leads to progressive muscular weakness due to repeated muscle fiber damage and degeneration. Now, how to remember the banding patterns? I have a mnemonic here for you. Zebras in a hayfield munching. Zebras in a hayfield munching. So zip together the ends of the sarcomere. It looks like a zipper. The I band, isolated thin filaments. So only thin filaments. Then A band, all filaments. So thick myosin overlapping thin actin. And then you have the H zone, which is heavy only, just the thick filaments, no actin overlap. And finally, the M line, which is the midpoint that anchors the thick filaments. Now, this is some quick physiology. Basically, I'm just going to go over this really quickly because you should be taking this in the physiology crash course. But you have something called the sliding filament theory. And what happens is that myosin heads are made to attach to actin and pull it in together. So it's supposed to slide over each other. It's kind of like a tug of war, right? And the sarcomere is going to shorten. Now let's take a quick break. Oops.
Hi, Malak, are you done?
No, not yet.
Okay, so sorry.
Is it recording?
Yes, it should still be recording. It is.
Okay. Could we pause the recording?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so we're back. Whoopsies. Okay. So we have the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, we have myofibrils are surrounded by this sarcoplasmic reticulum, all right? The network is going to extend from one AI junction to the next AI junction, all right? And what is the function of the sarcoplasmic reticulum? Is to store calcium ions during muscle relaxation and to release calcium ions during muscle contraction. So this is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And this is the T-tubule, which we're going to talk about next. But before we do that, we're going to talk about the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I don't think this is really important, but you have the longitudinal sarcoplasmic reticulum, the fenestrated, and the junctional. And you have, oopsies, the terminal cisterna, the junctional, or the terminal cisterna, which is the only one I think you need to know. So the T-tubules are going to be invaginations of the sarcolemma of the cell membrane at the AI junction, and it helps to conduct electrical impulses deep into the muscle. Okay, now it's not part of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it's located between each pair of terminal cisterna. So these are the terminal cisterna, this is the T-tubule, and they bring action potential deep into the muscle fiber. Now, oops, at the AI junction, you have three structures that form a triad. Like we said, the two terminal cisterna and one T-tubule, and the functions of the triad is that the T-tubule will spread the action potential, the sarcoplasmic reticulum or the terminal cisterna will store calcium during relaxation and release calcium during contraction. So terminal cisterna are the calcium reservoirs, T-tubule are for action potential conduction. Now, some more detail. So what is the role of calcium? The role of calcium is that it conducts the action potential, it travels along the sarcolemma and the T-tubules, and it triggers sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. Now, some more detail. The role of calcium is that it binds to troponin C, and tropomyosin will shift and it will expose the actin binding sites. Remember how we said we had tropomyosin covering the actin binding sites? Once troponin C binds to calcium, then tropomyosin will shift and it will expose the actin binding sites. And then this is what will happen. We have this cycle. Okay, I think you can go over it yourself because I don't really have much time to explain it, but because it should be covered in the physiology. Now, this is just a summary for the physiology. Calcium is what blows the whistle. It starts it off. ATP powers the pull, and myosin will grab the actin, and then it will repeat. Now let's classify muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are classified based on two things, the oxidative state or the metabolic profile and the myosin ATPase activity. Now, if there is high oxygen availability, that means that it will be able to do aerobic, okay, oxidative phosphorylation. If there's no oxygen available or low oxygen available, then it will go with anaerobic glycolysis. Now, for myosin ATPase activity, if it's slow, okay, ATPase activity, it will be slow twitch fibers. If it's fast ATPase activity, that means it breaks down ATP fast, then it will be fast twitch fibers. Now, let's talk about the metabolic profile. If there's high oxygen demand, then you'll have aerobic metabolism, which means that you need lots of mitochondria, lots of myoglobin, lots of blood supply. So the fibers are going to be red, kind of like this guy. Now, if they're low oxygen demand, they're going to be relying on anaerobic glycolysis. So there's going to be less mitochondria, less myoglobin, and it's going to be kind of pale white fiber. So there's more glycogen. And we said that fast ATPase breaks down ATP fast, and that leads to fast twitch contraction. Slow ATPase breaks down ATP slowly, that's slow twitch contraction. Now, this is the scary table, okay? It's really not that hard. We'll go through it together. Now, type 1 fibers, okay? Oopsies. Type 1 fibers. They're usually small fibers. They're slow oxidative, okay? They're slow twitch fibers, meaning that the slowest myosin ATPase activity, tamam? Which means that they have lots of mitochondria, okay? And they're oxidative, so they have lots of mitochondria, and they have lots of myoglobin, okay? And yeah, they're slow twitch fibers. Then you have type 2A, which is fast oxidative glycolytic. And these ones, they are fast, they have fast ATPase and they're fast twitch, okay? They're not faster than the fast glycolytic because they're oxidative glycolytic, so they have both, okay? And they have lots of mitochondria as well. Now, for type 2B, they are the fastest, okay? And they're the fast twitch fibers, okay? They're for rapid contraction and fine movements. And they have less mitochondria, less myoglobin. Okay, so now let's talk about the functional application of these fibers. Type 1 fibers, what are they used for? We said that they're slow oxidative, right? So they can be used for endurance activities, and that's because they rely on aerobic metabolism. As for type 2A, we have the fast oxidative glycolytic. It's used for middle distance activities, which is like hockey, swimming, etc. And it uses a mix of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. And type 2B is used for short bursts of intense activity like sprinting, weightlifting, and it relies on anaerobic glycolysis. This is the mnemonic: jog, run, sprint. Okay, so jog, type 1, run, type 2A, and sprint, type 2B. Jogging is slow and steady, so it looks like this. It has lots of myoglobin, lots of mitochondria, lots of oxygen, so it's good for long distance endurance. So it's good for over the long period. Then you have run, which is type 2, which is fast oxidative glycolytic, which is fast but with some endurance. So it's this one. It looks more pink. And it's going to be hybrid. So there's some oxygen use, some aerobics, some aerobics and some anaerobic, and it's more versatile, okay? And type 2B is going to be sprint. So there's low oxygen, high glycogen, quick bursts, easy fatigue, and the fibers are going to look more white, okay? So it's a fast burst, then you have a burnout. So jog, run, sprint, type 1, type 2A, type 2B. Now let's talk about motor innervation and neuromuscular junction. Now, where do the motor neurons come from? They arise from the spinal cord or from the brainstem, right? Now, the motor neurons, the motor unit. What is a motor unit? A motor unit is basically one motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. That is what we call a motor unit. There are many, many more muscle fibers than neurons. So a single neuron will innervate multiple muscle fibers. Now, there's a difference between uh, fine control muscles and strong coarse movements, okay? In the fine control, like the fingers, the eyes, the muscles are going to have, there's going to be fewer fiber or muscle fibers per neuron in each area that requires fine control, okay? Whereas there's going to be more fibers per neuron in the areas that need strong or coarse movements. And the branching, the axons will usually branch extensively to reach multiple muscle fibers. These are pictures of motor units. As you can see here, you can see that the motor units or the cells, the fiber extends to multiple muscle fibers, the neuron. And here you have the motor units, the difference between a small motor unit. Okay, this will more likely be a fine control muscle, and this one will be more likely to be a coarse movement muscle, like the arms or something like that. Then you have the neuromuscular junction, okay? The neuromuscular junction is the synapse between a motor neuron and a muscle fibrin. And this is also called the motor end plate, okay? And the structure here is that you have a presynaptic terminal. The axon terminal will contain the synaptic vesicles, which are filled with acetylcholine, and the synaptic cleft will have the gap which will be the gap between the neuron and the muscle fiber. And then you have the postsynaptic membrane, which is the region of the sarcolemma, or the cell membrane of the muscle fiber that has the junctional folds, okay, that are packed with acetylcholine receptors. Okay, so what's going to happen is that your junctional folds are here to increase the surface area for the receptors. And the mechanism of action, first of all, is that you have the action potential is going to depolarize at the nerve terminal, and then voltage-gated calcium will allow calcium to influx, right? And when that happens, that calcium is going to go to the synaptic vesicle, and that's going to cause the synaptic vesicle to bind and exocytose and release the ACH that's inside. And then the ACH is going to go and pass across the synaptic cleft. It's going to activate the receptors, and then there's going to be cation influx through the ACR through the receptors, yani, and there's going to be a voltage-gated sodium potential. Sodium channels, or they're going to open and they're going to generate an action potential, and then you have ACHE, which goes to degrade all of the ACH to خلاص يعني terminate the cycle or the signal. Now, what happens when at the whoops when you have autoantibodies against acetylcholine receptors and the neuromuscular junction? It's a disease called myasthenia gravis. Myasthenia gravis, okay, it happens when you have autoantibodies or antibodies against the own body, and they attack acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction. And this will lead to reduced muscle fiber response to nerve stimulation. Now, what are the clinical features? You're going to have ptosis, which is eyelid droop, okay, and diplopia, which is double vision. Okay, this is because of extra weakness in the extraocular muscles, and it will eventually progress to generalized muscle weakness, including the respiratory muscles. Did I include this twice? No. Okay. And the treatment is acetylcholine esterase inhibitors. Acetylcholine esterase is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, and if you have an inhibitor for that, it'll prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine, and that will improve the neuromuscular transmission. And there's also the other option is the immunosuppressants and thymectomy, which I don't really understand, but if thymic hyperplasia is present with myasthenia gravis, then apparently thymectomy, like removement of the thymus, helps. Now another checkpoint. Whoops. Okay, and we're back. So let's talk about the sensory receptors in muscle. So we have the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs. Okay, so for sensory innervation of muscle, okay, we have two types of receptors. We have both of them are encapsulated sensory receptors, and they exist in muscle. You have some of them in muscles and some of them in tendons. The ones in muscles, okay, will detect something called stretch, and the ones in tendons will detect something called tension. And these will send messages to the central nervous system about the body position and the movement. And they're part of the somatic nervous system. So, but what's the difference between tension and stretch and tension? Well, stretch is the change in length. So if you're pulling a rubber band, you're changing it. You're pulling it longer, you're changing the length. So you're stretching it. However, the tension is like pulling on a rope. So even if the rope isn't getting longer, kind of like a tug of war, there's kind of pulling on both ends. It creates a lot of tension inside the rope. Okay. Now let's talk about muscle spindles. So the stretch receptors, so they're found inside skeletal muscles. They detect muscle stretch and they initiate reflex contraction to maintain muscle tone. Now, what are the components of it? It has something called intrafusal fibers and neuron endings. Okay? The intrafusal fibers are two types. You have nuclear bag fibers and you have nuclear chain fibers. And the nuclear bag fibers, they're going to have a few nuclei and they're clustered. And this is the nuclear bag fiber, and this is the nuclear chain fiber. Okay, so these are like clustered nuclei, and then here they're nuclei in a row. And then you have the neuron endings. You have afferent and efferent. So the afferent neuron endings are going to be type 1A and type 2 fibers, and then the efferent are going to be gamma fibers. Okay, I don't think you need to know the details, but just know type 1A and type 2, and then efferent is gamma. Okay, so then you can see it here. You have the nuclear bag or the intrafusal fibers. Okay, the nuclear chain fibers. This is the nuclear chain fibers. These are the nuclear bag fibers, and you have the afferent and the efferent sensory neurons, and yeah. Then you have the Golgi tendon organ, which is the tension sensor inside the tendons, and it's found in the tendons near the muscle attachment. And it's responsible for monitoring muscle tension to prevent excessive force. Now, the mechanism is that it causes increased muscle contraction. Okay, so when there's increased muscle contraction, there will be increased tendon tension, and this will stimulate the Golgi tendon organ. This will send 1B, okay, 1B nerve afferents to the spinal cord, and that will activate the inhibitory interneurons, which will inhibit the alpha motor neurons that are responsible for moving the muscle, and this will relax the muscle, and this is what we call the inverse myotatic reflex. And you should have taken this in physiology. So this is just a review. Now, how do you remember it? When you're stretching a sweater, okay, you check many places so it doesn't rip, which means you have many neurons. So 1A and 2 are sensory, and gamma is motor. However, when you're pulling a rope for GTOs or Golgi tendon organs, you only need one scream when it's about to snap. So you have one neuron, so 1B, which is sensory only. Now let's talk about muscle repair and regeneration. Remember when we were talking about satellite cells? Satellite cells are responsible for something called skeletal muscle regeneration. So usually they're dormant, they're asleep, they don't do anything. But when there's injury happening, there are two cases, okay? If the basal lamina is intact and if the basal lamina is disrupted. If the basal lamina is intact, then the satellite cells will produce myogenic precursors, and those will produce myoblasts, those will fuse to form myotubes, and those myotubes will form muscle fibers. However, if the basal lamina is disrupted, then the fibroblasts are going to dominate, and there's going to be scar tissue forming without muscle regeneration. So this is what we have. If they're intact, the satellite cells are going to form myoblasts, and myoblasts are going to differentiate, they're going to fuse into myofibers. However, if external lamina is disrupted, then you have the myofibroblasts and they're going to form fibrotic tissue. Now, what are the effects of exercise on skeletal muscle? This is like kind of a clinical application. When you have strength training, okay, like weightlifting, this increases the muscle fiber size, and this is called hypertrophy. So it's, if you think of it, bodybuilders go to make their muscles bigger. So they get bigger, the muscle fibers get bigger in size, but it does not increase the number of muscle fibers. However, endurance training like running, cycling, etc., they don't cause hypertrophy, but what they do cause is an increased number of blood vessels, increased number of mitochondria, oxygen, glucose, and ATP delivery to fibers. And another checkpoint. Are you guys ready to move on to real histology images and question solving? Please. All right, let's get back into it. All right, let's get back into it. Now let's look at some real images. So, these are going to be in question format. I've explained it, so it should be a little bit easier for you to grasp the image. So what is P? What is E? What is EN? E is the epimysium, P is the perimysium, EN is the endomysium. And this is a quick reminder in case you forgot. What's this? This is a nucleus. And what about this? This is from external resources just to train your eye. This is the sarcolemma. This is the endomysium. This is the fiber. And this is the perimysium. This is also from external resources just to train your eye. So what is this? Oopsies. This is the perimysium. What about this? This is the endomysium. And this is the epimysium. What about here? So what do we call this stippled appearance? It's a cross section, right? Now you have this is the muscle fiber. This is the myofibril, and then this is the perimysium, and this is the endomysium, and this is the satellite cell. Then you have this, so what do we call this appearance? Striated, and it's a longitudinal section. So what are these? These are the nuclei. What are these? Striations. What is this? A muscle fiber. And what is this? This connective tissue surrounding it. It is the endomysium. Now this is an electron microscopic image. Okay. What are each of these? First of all, these are the Z lines. And then after that, this is the M line. This is the H band. This is the I band. And this is the A band. Same thing here. This is from external resources just to train your eye. What is this? Oops, this is the M line. What is this? The Z line. What is this? The I band. This is the A band. And this is the Z line also. Now, what is this? This is an electron microscopic image. So what are each of these things? What is SR? SR is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. MI is the mitochondria. I is the I band. A is the A band. And this is the AI junction. And the circles happen at the AI junction. So this is the triad. Okay, يلا متدلعين. Let's talk about the types of skeletal muscle fibers. So we have histochemical staining, special stains that help us differentiate between the different types of muscle fibers. Okay, so we have the myosin ATPase stain, which is the brown stain, and if it stains dark, then it's slow. Okay, so think of it as if it's dark, it's slow. It's type 1 fibers. If it's a light stain, then it's a fast ATPase, so it's type 2B. And if it's intermediate, then it's type 2A, okay? Then we have the NADHCR stain, which measures the oxidative enzyme activity, which will tell you the amount of mitochondria that are available inside the muscle fiber. So if it stains dark, that means you have more mitochondria, okay? But if it stains light, then you have fewer mitochondria. So in both cases, the darker color is most likely going to be type 1, and the lighter color is most likely to be type 2. Okay? Yeah. Now, what do these images depict? This is from your slides. These are motor units. Now, what is this? This is the electron microscopy of the neuromuscular junction. And these are the junctional folds. I just gave you an answer, but you tell me what these things are. What is S? What is GF? JF, المفروض JH, SV, N, SNC. Okay, so S is the Schwann cell. JF is the junctional folds. SV is the synaptic vesicles. N is the nucleus. M is the mitochondria. MF is the myofibrils. And SNC is the subneural clefts. Okay. Okay, what about this? This is easy. It's a muscle spindle. All right, so now we're done with the real images. Let's move on to question solving. So which of the following correctly describes the organization of skeletal muscle tissue? C C. Epimysium surrounds the entire skeletal muscle. The rest are incorrect. Which of the following statements correctly differentiates thin and thick filaments in skeletal muscle? D. Myasthenia gravis primarily affects which part of the neuromuscular junction? A. Acetylcholine receptors. Remember, autoantibodies against acetylcholine receptors. Electron microscopy of a muscle cross-section reveals large numbers of mitochondria, dense capillary networks, and predominance of smaller muscle fibers. Which of the following describes the fiber type observed? So large numbers of mitochondria, dense capillary networks. What is it going to be? Type 1 fibers. A physician taps the patellar tendon during a tendon reflex test, causing a sudden stretch in the quadriceps muscle and a subsequent leg extension. Which of the following is the sensory receptor that mediates this response? It's going to be the muscle spindle because it detects stretch. During a microscopic analysis of a skeletal muscle tissue, a histologist identifies a specialized site where a somatic motor neuron communicates with the muscle fiber. This region includes an expanded axon terminal, a synaptic cleft, and a muscle cell with specialized features at the site of synaptic input. Which of the following is characteristic of the postsynaptic region of the neuromuscular junction? And it's B, enfoldings of the sarcolemma known as junctional folds. Okay, you guys read this one. I'm really tired. And the answer is B. Now, mock OSPI, basically. What is a structure labeled A? Satellite cell. What are the connective tissues surrounding the entire muscle? Epimysium. Which is the band in the sarcomere that contains only thin filaments? Remember, I isolated. So isolated actin filaments. Then, name the structure where thin and thick filaments overlap. The A band. Remember A for all. And then name the line that bisects the I band. The Z line. And which is the structure that carries the action potential from the sarcolemma into the fiber? The T tubule. Now, final question. Name the structure stored in vesicles at the nerve terminal, acetylcholine. Describe the role of junctional folds to increase the surface area. Which disease is characterized by antibodies attacking AChR at the NMJ? Myasthenia gravis. All right, now it's the checkpoint. Okay, and we're back for the final time. Okay, finally, let's talk about skin. These are the things we're going to talk about. Now let's start with the structural organization of the skin, okay? So we know that the skin and its derivatives, so hair, nails, glands, they all form the integumentary system, and we all know that the skin is the biggest organ in the body, right? We know the functions of the skin, protection, sensation, excretion, homeostasis, endocrine, immune. It's all written down, it's all very clear, okay? Now let's get into the real stuff. Before we get into the real stuff, skin regenerates every 15 to 30 days. And if you have injury in the epidermis, then you have a high risk of infection. And if you have dermal injury only, then the skin still offers some protection. So for example, if you have a second-degree burn. Now let's talk about the difference between thin skin and thick skin, okay? Thick skin and thin skin. So the thickness of the skin will differ across the body depending on where you're talking about. Thick skin, okay, or the histological classification of the thickness of the skin is only based on the epidermal thickness, so the thickness of the epidermis only. Now, what is thick skin? Thick skin is usually found on the palms and the soles, and the thickest skin in your body is found on the upper back, and it usually doesn't have any hair follicles, okay? And it will have a very thick epidermis, and that resists abrasion. However, thin skin, on the other hand, is usually found on most parts of your body, specifically your eyelids. Your eyelids are the thinnest skin on your body. Now, It will contain hair follicles and glands, and it will be a very thin epidermis. Oh. Now, what are the layers of the skin? You have three layers. You have the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. The hypodermis isn't really a part of the skin, but it's very closely associated, so people usually consider it as the third layer of the skin. The epidermis, it's very important that you know how it's defined. It's keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So that means it's stratified squamous epithelium that has keratin on it, okay? And it maintains thickness via desquamation. And it contains keratinocytes, which are 90% of the cells of the epidermis, and it is avascular. As for the dermis is connective tissue that's subdivided into the papillary dermis and the reticular dermis. Papillary dermis has loose connective tissue, and the reticular dermis has dense, irregular connective tissue. Now, as for the hypodermis, you have loose connective tissue and adipose lobules, and they're not formally part of the skin, like we said, but they are closely associated, the hypodermis. Now, as we said, these are the layers of the skin. You have the epidermis, the dermis, which is made up of the papillary dermis and the reticular dermis, where you have the papillary dermis is made up of loose connective tissue, and the reticular dermis is made up of dense connective tissue. Oops. And the hypodermis, which is mostly made up of adipose, which is not technically part of the skin, but it's like it exists. So we mention it. طيب. What are the main functions of the epidermis? Well, it's important it's like we said, it has all the functions that we were talking about. It covers you, it renews every 15 to 30 days, it distinguishes between thick and thin skin histologically, and it has four types of cells, okay? First of all, it has the keratinocytes, which are the pink cells here, and these are the majority of the cells. These are basically the skin cells. They form the barrier. And then you have the melanocytes, which are the brown cells here, and these are the ones that contain the pigment, which is melanin. And then you have the Langerhans cells, which are the immune cells. They are the antigen-presenting cells. And you have the Merkel cells, okay, which are the sensory or sensory touch receptors and pressure receptors. And these three cells are called dendritic cells. Okay, now it's important to note that the epidermis is avascular, which means that nutrients and oxygen will diffuse to it from the dermis. Whoopsies. Okay, so the keratinocytes are 85% of the epidermal cells, so they make up a very big proportion, and they produce keratin. So they're called keratinocytes because they produce keratin, right? And it's a structural protein that's important for the epidermal water barrier. That's why your skin is waterproof. Now, what are the layers of the epidermis from deep to superficial? From deep to superficial, so from the inside to the out, you have stratum basale, or the germinativum, which is made up of stem cells that have that undergo mitosis, basically. Then you have the stratum spinosum, which are the spine-like projections, and they are due to desmosomes. Okay, the stratum granulosum, which contains filaggrin, and then you have stratum lucidum, which is only found in thick skin. It's clear and eosinophilic, and it has no organelles. And finally, the stratum corneum, or the corny layer, which is anucleated flattened cells filled with keratin. And in thin skin, like we said, the stratum lucidum is absent. So how do we remember it? Come, let's get sunburnt. Corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. Come, let's get sunburned. So again, here we have the stratum corneum, which is all the dead keratinocytes. Then we have the stratum lucidum, which is only in thick skin. Then we have the stratum granulosum, okay? Then we have the stratum spinosum, and then we have the stratum basale. And then here, stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, we can see it's granular, and then spinosum, it's like spiky, and then you have stratum basale, which is the very bottom layer. Let's start talking about stratum basale. Stratum basale is a single layer of cuboidal to columnar basophilic cells, and it contains stem cells for keratinocyte regeneration. So it's called the germinativum, right? and it has melanocytes here and there to donate melanin for UV protection. It's also rich in cytoskeletal keratins, and it has basophilic staining due to active protein synthesis. Now, this is the site of cell regeneration. It can regenerate after injury. Now, what are the cell junctions? In the stratum basal, they have a lot of cell junctions because you don't want anything to get past the skin to break through the skin. So you have cell-to-cell junctions, which are the desmosomes. They bind the cells to each other, and the hemidesmosomes, which bind the basal the cell to the basal lamina. Then you have the stratum spinosum, which is it's several layers thick. It has spines. The cells are larger and polyhedral. Okay, and this is why we call it the prickle cell layer. And they begin arranging things or accumulating things called tonofilaments, which are keratin precursors. Okay, and there's no pain receptors in the stratum spinosum. And yeah, it's acetophilic because of keratin content. So you can see it like this. Now we have the stratum granulosum, which is this layer. Okay, the stratum granulosum is 1 to 3 layers of cells, and they're flattened keratinocytes. They contain something called keratohyalin granules, which are rich in filaggrin, and that's why they are very basophilic. And then you have the stratum lucidum, which is very bright. It's only found in thick skin, and the cells are eosinophilic, clear, and anucleate, and they're still held together by desmosomes. Okay, and yeah. Then you'll have the stratum corneum. Sorry, mistake. And it's the most superficial layer, and it's made up of anucleated, keratin-filled squamous, which means they're anucleated, keratin-filled cells that are completely dead, okay? And the cell membranes will be coated with something called extracellular lipids, okay? And that's what causes the water barrier. It makes your skin waterproof. And the thickness of the stratum corneum will depend on the friction or the exposure that there is. So if there's it's in an area where there's a lot of friction, like for example your feet or your hands, there's going to be maybe calluses. Okay, so it'll be thicker. Like, how do keratinocytes differentiate? If you notice that there is kind of like a flow from the bottom up, now this is because the keratinocytes start in the stratum basale and they migrate to the stratum corneum. Okay, now stratum basale, it contains the free ribosomes. It contains scattered keratin filaments. It's everything. Okay, and then they're going to migrate upwards to the stratum spinosum, and the tonofilaments are going to group into tonofibrils, and the cytoplasm that's basophilic becomes acidophilic. Okay, I don't know how important this is because when I was in your year, we didn't take this, but hopefully it's not that high yield. Um, And then it reaches the upper stratum spinosum, and it begins the synthesis of keratohyalin granules, which contain filaggrin and trichohyalin, and then these initiate the keratinization when they're released. So filaggrin and trichohyalin are the things that cause keratinization when they're released, okay? So what are the steps of keratinization? One is the conversion to cornified cells, okay? It happens over 2 to 6 hours, and it breaks down the nucleus in the organisms, or sorry, or organelles. I'm very tired. And the thickening of the plasma membrane, and the pH will drop from about 7.2 to 4.6 to 4.5 to 6. Now, what causes the differentiation from the granulosum to the corneum? We have something called kallikrein-related peptidases, which break down the desmosomes, and then we have lectin, which is a KLK inhibitor, and it will maintain desmosomal integrity. What does that mean? Okay, so we have the epidermal layer, okay, which is the granular layer. The pH level here is neutral. So lectin will bind to KLK, which means that the desmosomes will remain intact, which means that the desmosomes will not break apart. However, when it starts approaching the stratum corneum, it gets more and more acidic. So when it gets more acidic, the lectin will dissociate from the KLK, and the KLK will become active, and then the KLK will degrade the desmosomal proteins, and that will cause the cells to detach. It will cause desquamation, okay? And that causes the formation of the corneum. Now, what are the lamellar bodies? Lamellar bodies look like this under the electron microscope, and basically they're formed in the Golgi of the keratinocytes in the stratum spinosum and granulosum. They contain lipids and enzymes and proteases and all of that, and they're secreted between the granulosum and the corneum. And what do? They create the epidermal water barrier, which is what makes your skin waterproof. And it aids in the cornified envelope formation, it's involved in desquamation, and it also helps in antimicrobial defense. Now, what is the epidermal water barrier? It is here to keep your skin dry, protects it from water loss and pathogen entry. And what's it composed of? It's composed of two parts, the cornified envelope, which is inside the cell, and the lipid envelope, which is outside the cell, okay? Now, the cornified envelope, okay, the cell envelope, which is inside the cell, it has insoluble proteins like loricrin, and this adds mechanical strength. However, the lipid envelope, which is outside the cell, this part, is derived from the lamellar bodies and it contains cholesterol and free fatty acids. Now let's talk about melanocytes. Melanocytes, what are they? So we finished talking about keratinocytes. Now let's talk about melanocytes. Whoops. Okay, where do they come from? They come from neural crust cells embryonically. And where are they located? They are located in the stratum basal, and their processes will extend upwards into the stratum spinosum. Now we have something called a melanin epidermal unit, which is when you have one melanocyte and about 36 keratinocytes. And this ratio is constant in all skin types. And what is the function of melanocytes? They are to synthesize eumelanin, which is brown-black color, and pheomelanin, which is red-yellow. So eumelanin, brown-black, pheomelanin, red-yellow. And it's responsible for melanin export, not for storage. Now, what are the skin color differences? How do you have different skin colors in different people? It's because of the amount, the size, and the distribution of melanin in keratinocytes, not the melanocyte number. So the melanocyte number is constant in all skin types. The epidermal melanin unit is always 1 to about 36 one melanocyte to about 36 keratinocytes, always like very constant ratio, but the difference is in the amount and the size and the distribution of melanin in the keratinocytes, not in the melanocyte number. Now, the structure of melanocytes, they're usually very rounded cell bodies, they're very pale staining, and they're anchored to the basal lamina via hemidesmosomes. And they have extensions, so they have dendritic processes, and they pass between the basal spinous keratinocytes. And they have many mitochondria, rough endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi, because these produce the melanin and the melanosomes. Okay, then we have the melanosome, which is the melanin producing organelle. Okay, so this is the melanosome. Okay, and you have different stages of development of the melanosome. So first stage is where you have the tyrosinase is present. There's no melanin yet, so you can't really see any color. And then you have stage 2, which is the filament organization, which is where melanin synthesis begins to happen, okay? And then you have stage 3, which is melanin deposition, it increases. And then stage 4, you have fully pigmented and it's transferred to the keratinocytes. Now, only stage 4 are donated to keratinocytes. So you have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. Just remember each one. Stage 1, there's no melanin yet, and then melanin synthesis begins, and then there's melanin deposition increasing, and then it's fully pigmented. And stage 4 is the one that is donated, okay? So how is melanin synthesis happening? How is it degraded? First of all, you have something called L-tyrosine. Okay, tyrosine is one of your amino acids, and tyrosine via tyrosinase is going to be hydroxylated into L-dopa, and from L-dopa into L-dopaquinone by oxidation again. And then from L-dopaquinone, you have either pheomelanin or eumelanin. TRP1 will if you have enough cysteine, you'll have pheomelanin. If you don't have enough cysteine, you'll have eumelanin. So enough enough cysteine will give you pheomelanin, which is a reddish yellow color, And if you don't have enough cysteine, it'll give you eumelanin, which is a brownish black color. And how is it degraded? By autophagy and cathepsin 2 protease, which is on the next slide. Oops, okay. On the slide after this one. But before we talk about that, let's talk about albinism. What is albinism? It's a genetic congenital disorder, and it's caused by tyrosinase deficiency, which means that there's no melanin production. And melanocytes are present, but they're non-functional, okay? So they don't really do their job. Now, melanin donation happens. It's passed to keratinocytes by the phagocytosis of melanocyte dendritic tips. And in keratinocytes, the melanin, okay, so here there's going to be some sort of phagocytosis as you can see, of the melanocyte dendritic tips. So the melanin goes into each of the keratinocytes and it just exists in there. In the keratinocytes, the melanin will form a kind of a dark umbrella over the nucleus. Okay? So it will form like an umbrella over the nucleus, and this protects the nucleus from UV. And keratinocytes will contain more melanin than melanocytes themselves. Okay, so these are the melanosomes. They're going around the nucleus, making kind of an umbrella. Okay. Now, let's talk about skin color. Like we said, it depends on the melanosome, the number and the size and the distribution, not the number of melanocytes. So the difference between dark skin and light skin is that the melanosomes in the dark skin will be numerous, large, and they're spread out through the epidermis. And there's fewer in light skin, there's fewer, smaller, and clustered. Sorry, I'm yawning. And pigment type will be more eumelanin in dark skin and more pheomelanin in light skin. As for melanin degradation, it will be slower, so there will be less cathepsin L2. And in light skin, it will be faster, so there will be more cathepsin L2, which is responsible for degradation of melanin. Now let's talk about Langerhans cells. Langerhans cells are antigen-presenting cells. They come from the blood monocytes, okay? And they are most visible in the stratum spinosum. They make up about 2 to 8% of the epidermal cells. Now, what is their structure? They're dendritic cells, which means that they have long processes and they extend between keratinocytes, and they don't have any desmosomes, okay, which makes sense because they're immune cells. They're kind of like a policeman. They're like patrolling, so they can move freely between the cells. But what is their function? They are the first line of defense in the epidermis, right? Which means that they phagocytose antigens, they migrate to lymph nodes, and they present to T lymphocytes. They're APCs, and they're antigen presenting cells, and they have a key in initiating adaptive immune responses. What about Merkel cells? Okay, so Merkel cells are the last cell type we're going to talk about. So we've talked about keratinocytes, Langerhans cells, melanocytes. Now let's talk about Merkel cells. These are epitheliotactile cells, which, what is their origin? Allahu alam, nobody knows. But their location is in the stratum basale. So you have, most of the cells are located in the stratum basale. You have the melanocytes, you have the Merkel cells. Those two are located in the stratum basale. The Langerhans was in the um it was in any layer because it can move freely between the cells. تمام. Um now the location is in the stratum basale, like we said, especially in touch sensitive areas like the fingertips and the lips. And the structure is that they are dendritic cells. Again, they have a lobulated nucleus and a dense cytoplasm, and they contain neurosecretory granules and keratin filaments, and the desmosomes will bind them to adjacent keratinocytes. Okay, now what is the neural integration? It means that Merkel cells are associated with myelinated nerve endings, okay? And they form something called a Merkel's corpuscle, which is a Merkel cell and an afferent neuron. And this will act as a mechanoreceptor for touch and pressure. طيب. Now that we're done talking about all the cells, let's talk about the dermal epidermal junction. What is it? It is formed by, It is formed by the epidermal ridges, which have downward projections called the rete and they are dermal papillae. There are upward projections of the dermis, and the function is to increase the surface area for attachment. It resists shear forces, and it's most prominent at the fingertips, and it creates fingerprints. So this is the dermal ridges. These are the furrows. These are the epidermal ridges, and these are the dermal papillae. And these are the fingerprints, like you guys know. They're caused by elevated dermal ridges and the lower furrows. Okay, so this is the dermal epidermal junction. Okay, now let's talk about the dermis. We said that it's the connective tissue layer that happens to be under the epidermis, and it has multiple thicknesses, and it's made up of two types. It's made up of the papillary and the reticular layer. It's vascular, so it supplies nutrients to the avascular epidermis, and the elastic fibers tend to decrease with age. And then we have the papillary layer, which is the superficial layer, which includes the dermal papillae, which is this one, the papillary layer, and it's made up of loose connective tissue, and it has type 1 and type 3 collagen, and it has elastic fibers, fibroblasts, immune cells, capillaries, nerve endings, you name it. And the functions are to nourish the epidermis via the capillaries and to provide sensory input and immune defense. Now, finally, we have the reticular layer, which is the deeper and thicker layer, and it's made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. And it's mostly type 1 collagen, coarse elastic fibers, and dermatan sulfate proteoglycans. And they will contain blood vessels, lymphatics, sweat glands, and they're related to Langer lines. The reticular layer basically is related to the Langer lines. If you guys remember, or if you guys have heard, Langer lines are basically the lines that are important in surgical incisions. If you cut parallel to the Langer lines, then you have less scarring. Now, what is the hypodermis? It's technically not part of the skin, but it's just underneath it, so we like to consider it as part of it. And it's made up of loose connective tissue and adipocytes, and it anchors the skin to underlying organs and allows the mobility of the skin. And it's very highly vascularized, which is very important for drug and insulin absorption, as well as surgery. You need to be very careful. And it provides insulation, shock absorption, and energy storage. Now, for the reticular, oops. Now let's talk about vitiligo. Vitiligo is an acquired autoimmune condition, and it results from the destruction or the dysfunction of melanocytes, and it leads to depigmented skin patches. Okay, let's take a break here. Okay, so now that we have talked about all the cell types, okay, now let's talk about the sensory receptors. So there's unencapsulated and there's encapsulated receptors. The unencapsulated ones are like the free nerve endings, the Merkel discs we just talked about, and something called the root hair plexus. And then we have the capsulated receptors, like the Pacinian, the Meissner, the Ruffini. Now let's talk about the unencapsulated ones real quick. The Merkel corpuscle is found in the epidermis, okay, and it contains the Merkel cells and the disc receptors of an afferent myelinated nerve fiber. And what it does is that it's a mechanoreceptor for light touch. Okay. Now the free nerve endings are in the papillary dermis. They extend down into the lower epidermal layer, and they lack a connective tissue or a Schwann cell investment. And they respond to high and low temperatures, pain and itching, and also tactile receptors. Now, for the root hair plexuses, they're found in the reticular dermis. So you have epidermis, papillary dermis, reticular dermis. Okay? And they have a web of sensory fibers. They surround the bases of hair follicles. And what it does is, since it's a root hair plexus, so it detects the movements of hairs. Now let's talk about the capsulated sensory receptors, Meissner's corpuscles. So let's start with Meissner's corpuscle. You have the location. It's found in the dermal papilla of the hairless skin. And what it is basically 1 to 2 nerve endings, and they are spiraling through the corpuscle, and you have flattened Schwann cells. Okay, they form the irregular lamellae, and the function is that they are touch receptors for light and low-frequency stimuli. And then you have Pacinian corpuscles, which are found in the reticular dermis and the hypodermis, and they're also found in joints, periosteum, pancreas, and the structure is that they are large oval and they have lots of concentric lamellae. So if you look at it, it just looks like an onion. That's how I remember it. And no, Pacinian, it looks like an onion. Pacinian, onion. But yeah. And then you have also Pacinian. The pathway is that the myelinated nerve enters the capsule, it loses its myelin, and then the unmyelinated portion travels to the opposite side and it detects deep pressure, vibration, and mechanical changes. Then you have the capsulated sensory receptor, which the other capsulated sensory receptor, which is Ruffini's corpuscle, and it's found deep in the dermis. And it has like a thin collagenous layer enclosing fluid, and then a single myelinated fiber loses its myelin when it enters, and then it forms a kind of a tree with knob-like endings, and then it responds to skin stretch and torque as well. Now, these are the epidermal skin appendages. You have the hair follicles, the nail beds, sebaceous glands, eccrine glands, and apocrine glands. The hair follicles, they produce hair. The nail beds, they produce nails. Sebaceous glands produce sebum. Eccrine form watery sweat, and apocrine form viscous sweat, which has pheromones. Okay? Now, what are the hair follicles in the hair? What is their origin? It's an invagination of the epidermis. So the epidermis goes down like this and it forms an invagination. It's absent in the palms, in the soles, in the lips, and the urogenital regions. And it's regulated by sex hormones. And the color depends on the type and content of the melanin. Now, what is the structure of the hair follicle? You have something called the infundibulum, which is the surface, okay? And from the surface to the opening of the sebaceous gland, okay, right here. Then you have the isthmus. The isthmus would be the sebaceous gland to the erector pili muscle. So this is the isthmus. And then from the erector, then you have the follicular bulge, which contains the epidermal stem cells. So follicular bulge. And then you have the inferior segment, which is the from the erector pili down to the bulb. And this is the site of the active growth, okay? Then you have the structure of the hair follicle. The hair follicle itself, you have the hair shaft itself. You have the medulla, which is the central core, the medulla of the hair. Then you have the hard keratin, the cortex, which is hard keratin, and then the cuticle, which is the outermost layer. And then the hair follicle itself, you have the internal root sheath, which gives you the cuticle of IRS, and then Huxley's layer, and then Henley's layer. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know how important these are because I haven't taken them, but for these lectures, like study them well, okay? Now, the external root sheath is continuous with the epidermis, and the dermal sheath will be surrounding the follicle. This is the structure of the hair follicle. So here you have the medulla, and this is the cortex, and then this is the IRS, the ERS, and the follicular bulge. Yeah. Then the hair matrix. It contains matrix keratinocytes, okay, which proliferate for hair growth, and you have the melanocytes, which are for pigment production. So you have keratinocytes and melanocytes in the hair, and they're located just above the dermal papilla. And then in this picture, you can see the cells of the external root sheath. You can see Henley's layer, Huxley's layer, and then the cuticle of the internal root sheath, and then the cuticle of the hair shaft. And then now let's talk about the nails. The nails are basically, well, you can look at them and you can tell me that they're translucent, they're hard keratinized sheets, and they're present over the dorsal distal phalanx, and they are formed from flattened epithelial cells of the germinal matrix, and they are made of hard keratin, just like hair. And what's the structure? So you have the nail plate, which is the hard visible nail, and then you have the nail root, which is the matrix, and then the nail bed, okay, which is the epidermis beneath the nail. So the nail plate, the nail root, okay, the nail root, the nail matrix, and then you have the aponychium, okay, and the hyponychium, which is just under the nail, and then the perionychium, which is the nail wall surrounding skin, and the sealed edges, which are the aponychium and the hyponychium, the nail matrix. And let's talk about the glands, okay? You have sebaceous glands, eccrine glands, and apocrine glands. So sebaceous glands exist with the hair. Eccrine glands are sweat glands, and apocrine glands are the stinky sweat glands. Now, what are sebaceous glands? They are simple branched acinar glands, and they are typically exocrine. They secrete holocrine secretion. What does that mean? It means hollow. So if you think of it, it hollows itself out. It throws itself out. So the entire sebocyte bursts and it releases sebum, lipids, and debris. And there's no myoepithelial cells, unlike in sweat glands. So there's no need for anything to squeeze it. It just explodes. So it has a holocrine secretion. Then we have the ducts. Okay, so the ducts open into the hair follicle or directly on the skin for the sebaceous gland, okay, in the areas that are hairless. And the acini will consist of the basal layer and the sebocytes. The basal layer, okay, which are the flat cells that divide, and the sebocytes are the lipid-filled cells, and they're usually the lighter stain. Now, for the sebaceous glands, they usually develop from the external root sheath, and they're associated with hair follicles. They're not there in palms and soles. And the hairless regions, okay, the ducts will open onto the skin, and the pilosebaceous unit, like the hair follicle, the shaft, arrector pili, and the sebaceous gland, this is what makes up the pilosebaceous unit. Okay, so hair follicle, shaft, arrector pili, and the sebaceous gland. Now, the sweat glands can be classified based on their structure and the nature of their secretion. We have eccrine glands and apocrine glands. Eccrine glands are distributed over the entire body surface um, except for the border of the lips, the nail bed, and the external genitalia. And they are mostly numerous in the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and the skin of the axilla, and the forehead and the trunk. As for the apocrine glands, they are limited to the axilla, and the areole, the nipple of the mammary gland, etc. And the ceruminous glands of the ear are also called apocrine glands, okay? Now, eccrine glands, also called merocrine sweat glands, they are found in the entire body except for the lips, the nail beds, the parts of the external genitalia, and the most numerous places they are in the palms, the soles, the axilla, and the forehead. And what are they? They are simple coiled tubular glands, so they're kind of like a snake, and they're not associated with hair follicles, and they come from the epidermal downgrowth. And what are their parts? The structure is there's a secretory segment, okay, which is stratified cuboidal epithelium, and it has clear cells which form watery sweat. It has dark cells which form glycoproteins, which have glycoproteins and bactericidal proteins, and myoepithelial cells which are contractile on the basal lamina. And the duct segment, it has stratified cuboidal, okay, and acidophilic. It's acidophilic, okay, no myoepithelial cells in the ducts, and the epidermal portion has the acrosyringium. Now, the functions are for thermoregulation, for cooling, and watery hypotonic sweat. Now we can see here, this is the acrosyringium, okay? This is the duct of the eccrine gland. There's no myoepithelial cells on the outside. Once again, okay? Then we have the apocrine sweat glands, which are the stinky glands, okay? They're found in every area that could possibly be stinky. So the axilla, the perianal region, the external genitalia, the areola, okay? So, and they also include the ceruminous glands and the glands of Moll, which are in the eyes, the eyelids, and the ear. And like, oh, okay, sorry. I copied this twice. Okay, and the structure is that they have the secretory segment or the glandular segment is simple cuboidal eosinophilic cells. They have large lumens and they have apical bleb-like protrusions seen histologically, as well as myoepithelial cells on basal lamina. And the duct segment is stratified cuboidal, no myoepithelial cells, and it opens into the hair follicle. Now, the apocrine sweat glands, they secrete viscous protein-rich and it contains pheromones. This is what their secretion looks like. It's odorless initially, and then it becomes odorous with bacterial activity as shown in this diagram. And these are the types of skin, summarized for you guys can read through it. And this is once again, and this is skin repair. So we have clot formation. You have the wound, first of all. It begins with blood quickly clotting and releasing platelet-derived growth factor here. And then you have inflammation and epithelial migration. So macrophages and neutrophils will enter the wound to clean the debris. And then proliferation and granulation tissue, connective tissue, and will come here. And it's rich in collagen and new capillaries. And then maturation and remodeling. So the epidermis will gradually reestablish continuity over the wound site. And finally, skin aging. I think you guys can just read over this. Okay, now let's look at some real images. So, sebocytes, basal layer, basal lamina, nail root, nail matrix, eponychium, pacinium corpuscle, nail, hyponychium, pacinium corpuscle. What is the order? DBAC. What is this? Furrows, dermal ridges, epidermal ridges, dermal papillae. What are these? They're Langerhans cells, and these are melanocytes. And then from up to down, that is the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basal, and the dermis. And then what's this and what's this? This is thin skin, this one is thin skin, this one is thick skin. And finally, just a few more questions. Which of the following statements about the epidermis is true? C. Very easy. Which of the following layers of epidermis contains stem cells? Stratum basale. Which of the following functions is not performed by the skin? Very obvious. C. And that's it for today. I have some tips for you. Please read the question carefully, especially in MCQs. Watch for words like except, all of the following true or false. Like you guys need to make sure that you're reading the questions really carefully. Make sure that you flag the sticky question, the tricky questions, and you just move on. Don't get stuck in the beginning. Just answer the easy ones first. And then predict answers before looking at the choices, because if you look at the choices, you might look at a wrong answer and it sounds right, but it's not right. So try to guess the answer before looking at the choices, okay? Now for OSPI, read the station immediately and highlight highlight keywords. So identify means don't start explaining. If it says compare, then you show the differences, tamam? And then you have you need to be calm and systematic. So you approach the histology slide or diagram step by step. So what tissue, what key features, and what's clinical link, tamam? And finally, you memorize key visual landmarks. You have, for example, skeletal muscle, you have striations, peripheral nuclei, you have cartilage, striations and peripheral nuclei. I'm brain dead. And cartilage is lacuna and matrix. Thank you for joining. Thank you for learning with me today. It was a very long session. Apologies, but I tried to cover as much as possible in it. I hope it was useful to you, and thank you for listening. My name is Malak Hassan, and these are my contact details. And yeah, let's end the game. Please rate the game, scan the QR code, and thank you very much.